by the core writing team, synthesis report, IPCC, Rohendra K. Pachari, Chairman Unit, IPCC, Leo Mayer, Head Technical Support, IPCC. Core writing team, R.K. Pachari, Chair, Miles R. Allen, United Kingdom, Vicente Ricardo Barros, Argentina, John Broom, United Kingdom, Wolfgang Kramer, Germany, France, Renata Christ, Austria, WMO, John A. Church, Australia, Leon Clark, USA, Ken Dahe, China, Purnamita Dasgupta, India, Navroz K. Dubash, India, Otmar Edenhofer, Germany, Ismail El Ghazuli, Sudan, B. Field, USA, Piers Forster, United Kingdom, Pierre Friedlingstein, United Kingdom, Belgium, Jan Fu, Stephanie Heligata, France, World Bank, Gabrielle Hegel, United Kingdom, Mark Howden, Australia, Keijun Jiang, China, Blanca Jimenez Cisneros, Mexico, UNESCO, Vladimir Katsov, Russian Federation, Ho-Sung Lee, Republic of Korea, Catherine J. Mack, USA, Joachim Morotska, Germany, Michael D. Mastrandrea, USA, Leo Mayer, Netherlands, Jan Minks, Germany, Jakob Mulugeta, Ethiopia, Karen O'Brien, Norway, Michael Oppenheimer, USA, Joy J. Pereira, Malaysia, Ramon Pish-Madruga, Cuba, Jean Casper Plattner, Switzerland, Hans Otto Portner, Germany, Scott B. Power, Australia, Benjamin Preston, USA, N.H. Ravindranath, India, Andy Reisinger, New Zealand, K1 Riahi, Austria, Matilda Rastucci, Argentina, Robert Scholes, South Africa, Kristin Saboth, USA, Yuba Sakona, Mali, Robert Stavins, USA, Thomas F. Stocker, Switzerland, Petra Chakert, USA, Detlef van Vuren, the Netherlands, Jan Pascal van Bailey, Belgium. Technical support for the synthesis report, Leo Mayer, Sander Brinkman, Lynn van Kesteren, Naomi Leprince Ringwe, Fika van Boxmeer. Extended core writing team, Gabriel Blanco, Argentina, Michael Eby, Canada, Jay Edmonds, USA, Mark Flurby, France, Rhea Gerla, the Netherlands, Sivan Carther, USA, Howard Kunreuter, USA, Yuri Jogel, Austria, Belgium, Michael Schaefer, the Netherlands, Jan Sedlacek, Switzerland, Ralph Sims, New Zealand, Diana Ergvorsach, Hungary, David Victor, USA, Gary Yo, USA. Review editors, Paulina Adonche, Chile, Thomas Downing, United Kingdom, Sylvie Hossein, France, Zbigniew Kundowicz, Poland, Jan Politikov, Australia, Jim Skay, United Kingdom, Kanako Tanaka, Japan, Fredolin Tangang, Malaysia, Chen Wei-ying, China, Zhang Xiaoye, China. The synthesis report of the Fifth Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, is dedicated to the memory of Stephen H. Schneider, one of the foremost climate scientists of our time. Steve Schneider, trained as a plasma physicist, embraced scholarship in the field of climate science almost 40 years ago and continued his relentless efforts creating new knowledge in the field and informing policymakers and the public at large on the growing problem of climate change and solutions for dealing with it. At all times, Steve Schneider remained intrepid and forthright in expressing his views. His convictions were driven by the strength of his outstanding scientific expertise. He was highly respected as founding editor of the interdisciplinary journal Climatic Change and hundreds of books and published papers, many of which were co-authored with scientists from diverse disciplines. His association with the IPCC began with the first assessment report, which was published in 1990, and which played a major role in the scientific foundation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Subsequently, he was lead author coordinating lead author and expert reviewer for various assessment reports, and a member of the core writing team for the fourth assessment report, AR4. His life and accomplishments have inspired and motivated members of the core writing team of this report. Steve Schneider's knowledge was a rare synthesis of several disciplines which are an essential part of the diversity inherent in climate science. Contents. Summary for policymakers. SPM 1, observed changes and their causes. SPM 2, future climate changes, risks and impacts. SPM 3, future pathways for adaptation, mitigation and sustainable development. SPM 4, adaptation and mitigation. Summary for policymakers. SPM introduction. This synthesis report is based on the reports of the 3 working groups of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, including relevant special reports. It provides an integrated view of climate change as the final part of the IPCC's 5th assessment report, AR5. This summary follows the structure of the longer report, which addresses the following topics: observed changes and their causes, future climate change, risks and impacts, future pathways for adaptation, mitigation and sustainable development, adaptation and mitigation. In the synthesis report, the certainty in key assessment findings is communicated as in the working group reports and special reports. It is based on the author team's evaluations of underlying scientific understanding and is expressed as a qualitative level of confidence from very low to very high and, when possible, probabilistically with a quantified likelihood from exceptionally unlikely to virtually certain. Where appropriate, findings are also formulated as statements of fact without using uncertainty qualifiers. This report includes information relevant to Article 2 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. SPM 1, observed changes and their causes. Human influence on the climate system is clear, and recent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history. Recent climate changes have had widespread impacts on human and natural systems. SPM 1.1, observed changes in the climate system. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and ocean have warmed, the amount of snow and ice have diminished, and sea level has risen. Each of the last 3 decades has been successively warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. The period from 1983 to 2012 was likely the warmest 30-year period in the last 1400 years in the Northern Hemisphere, where such assessment is possible, medium confidence. The globally averaged combined land and ocean surface temperature data, as calculated by a linear trend, show a warming of 0.8 degrees Celsius over the period 1880 to 2012, when multiple independently produced data sets exist. In addition to robust multi-decadal warming, the globally average surface temperature exhibits substantial decadal and interannual variability. Due to this natural variability, trends based on short records are very sensitive to the beginning and end dates and do not in general reflect long-term climate trends. As one example, the rate of warming over the past 15 years, 0.05 degrees Celsius per decade, which begins with a strong El Niño, is smaller than the rate calculated since 1951, 0.12 degrees Celsius per decade. Ocean warming dominates the increase in energy stored in the climate system, accounting for more than 90% of the energy accumulated between 1971 and 2010, high confidence, with only about 1% stored in the atmosphere. On a global scale, the ocean warming is largest near the surface, and the upper 75 metres warmed by 0.11 degrees Celsius per decade over the period 1971 to 2010. It is virtually certain that the upper ocean, 0 to 700 metres, warmed from 1971 to 2010, and it likely warmed between the 1870s and 1971. Averaged over the mid-latitude land areas of the Northern Hemisphere, Precipitation has increased since 1901, medium confidence before and high confidence after 1951. For other latitudes, area average long-term positive or negative trends have low confidence. Observations of changes in ocean surface salinity also provide indirect evidence for changes in the global water cycle over the ocean, medium confidence. It is very likely that regions of high salinity, where evaporation dominates, have become more saline, while regions of low salinity, where precipitation dominates, have become fresher since the 1950s. Since the beginning of the industrial era, oceanic uptake of carbon dioxide has resulted in acidification of the ocean. The pH of ocean surface water has decreased by 0.1, high confidence, corresponding to a 26% increase in acidity measured as hydrogen ion concentration. Over the period 1992 to 2011, the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets have been losing mass, high confidence, likely at a larger rate over 2002 to 2011. Glaciers have continued to shrink almost worldwide, high confidence. Northern Hemisphere spring snow cover has continued to decrease in extent, high confidence. There is high confidence that permafrost temperatures have increased in most regions since the early 1980s in response to increased surface temperature and changing snow cover. The annual mean Arctic sea ice extent decreased over the period 1979 to 2012, with a rate that was very likely in the range 3.5 to 4.1% per decade. Arctic sea ice extent has decreased in every season and in every successive decade since 1979, with the most rapid decrease in decadal mean extent in summer, high confidence. It is very likely that the annual mean Antarctic sea ice extent increased in the range of 1.2 to 1.8% per decade between 1979 and 2012. However, there is high confidence that there are strong regional differences in Antarctica, with extent increasing in some regions and decreasing in others. Over the period 1901 to 2010, global mean sea level rose by 0.19 metres. The rate of sea level rise since the mid-19th century has been larger than the mean rate during the previous 2 millennia, high confidence. SPM 1.2, Causes of Climate Change. Anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have increased since the pre-industrial era, driven largely by economic and population growth, and are now higher than ever. This has led to atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that are unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. Their effects, together with those of other anthropogenic drivers, have been detected throughout the climate system and are extremely likely to have been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. Anthropogenic greenhouse gas, GHG, emissions since the pre-industrial era have driven large increases in the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Between 1750 and 2011, cumulative anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere were 2040 plus or minus 310 gigatons of CO2. About 40% of these emissions have remained in the atmosphere. The rest was removed from the atmosphere and stored on land, in plants and soils, and in the ocean. The ocean has absorbed about 30% of the emitted anthropogenic carbon dioxide, causing ocean acidification. About half of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions between 1750 and 2011 have occurred in the last 40 years, high confidence. Total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have continued to increase over 1970 to 2010, with larger absolute increases between 2000 and 2010, despite a growing number of climate change mitigation policies. anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in 2010 have reached 49 plus or minus 4.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. Emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes contributed about 78% of the total greenhouse gas emissions increase from 1970 to 2010, with a similar percentage contribution for the increase during the period 2000 to 2010. High confidence. Globally, economic and population growth continue to be the most important drivers of increases in carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel combustion. The contribution of population growth between 2000 and 2010 remained roughly identical to the previous 3 decades, while the contribution of economic growth has risen sharply. Increased use of coal has reversed the long-standing trend of gradual decarbonisation, i.e. reducing the carbon intensity of energy, of the world's energy supply. High confidence. The evidence for human influence on the climate system has grown since the 4th Assessment Report, AR4. It is extremely likely that more than half of the observed increase in global average surface temperature from 1951 to 2010 was caused by the anthropogenic increase in greenhouse gas concentrations and other anthropogenic forcings together. The best estimate of the human-induced contribution to warming is similar to the observed warming over this period. Anthropogenic forcings have likely made a substantial contribution to surface temperature increases since the mid-20th century over every continental region except Antarctica. Anthropogenic influences have likely affected the global water cycle since 1960 and contributed to the retreat of glaciers since the 1960s and to the increased surface melting of the Greenland ice sheet since 1993. Anthropogenic influences have very likely contributed to Arctic sea ice loss since 1979 and have very likely made a substantial contribution to increases in global upper ocean heat content and to global mean sea level rise observed since the 1970s. SPM 1.3 Impacts of climate change. In recent decades, changes in climate have caused impacts on natural and human systems on all continents and across the oceans. Impacts are due to observed climate change, irrespective of its cause, indicating the sensitivity of natural and human systems to changing climate. Evidence of observed climate change impacts is strongest and most comprehensive for natural systems. In many regions, changing precipitation or melting snow and ice are altering hydrological systems, affecting water resources in terms of quantity and quality, medium confidence. Many terrestrial, freshwater and marine species have shifted their geographic ranges, seasonal activities, migration patterns, abundances and species interactions in response to ongoing climate change. High confidence. Some impacts on human systems have also been attributed to climate change, with a major or minor contribution of climate change distinguishable from other influences. Assessment of many studies covering a wide range of regions and crops shows that negative impacts of climate change on crop yields have been more common than positive impacts. High confidence. Some impacts of ocean acidification on marine organisms have been attributed to human influence. Medium confidence. SPM 1.4 Extreme events. Changes in many extreme weather and climate events have been observed since about 1950. Some of these changes have been linked to human influences, including a decrease in cold temperature extremes, an increase in warm temperature extremes, an increase in extreme high sea levels, and an increase in the number of heavy precipitation events in a number of regions. It is very likely that the number of cold days and nights has decreased and the number of warm days and nights has increased on the global scale. It is likely that the frequency of heat waves has increased in large parts of Europe, Asia, and Australia. It is very likely that human influence has contributed to the observed global scale changes in the frequency and intensity of daily temperature extremes since the mid-20th century. It is likely that human influence has more than doubled the probability of occurrence of heat waves in some locations. There is medium confidence that the observed warming has increased heat-related human mortality and decreased cold-related human mortality in some regions. There are likely more land regions where the number of heavy precipitation events has increased than where it has decreased. Recent detection of increasing trends in extreme precipitation and discharge in some catchments imply greater risks of flooding at regional scale, medium confidence. It is likely that extreme sea levels, for example as experienced in storm surges, have increased since 1970, being mainly a result of rising mean sea level. Impacts from recent climate-related extremes, such as heat waves, droughts, floods, cyclones and wildfires, reveal significant vulnerability and exposure of some ecosystems and many human systems to current climate variability. Very high confidence. SPM2. Future climate changes, risks and impacts. Continued emissions of greenhouse gases will cause further warming and long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasing the likelihood of severe, pervasive and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystems. Limiting climate change would require substantial and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which, together with adaptation, can limit climate change risks. SPM 2.1. Key drivers of future climate. Cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide largely determine global mean surface warming by the late 21st century and beyond. Projections of greenhouse gas emissions vary over a wide range, depending on both socio-economic development and climate policy. Anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are mainly driven by population size, economic activity, lifestyle, energy use, land use patterns, technology and climate policy. The representative concentration pathways, RCPs, which are used for making projections based on these factors, describe 4 different 21st century pathways of greenhouse gas emissions and atmospheric concentrations, air pollutant emissions and land use. The RCPs include a stringent mitigation scenario, RCP 2.6, 2 intermediate scenarios, RCP 4.5 and RCP 6.0, and 1 scenario with very high greenhouse gas emissions, RCP 8.5. Scenarios without additional efforts to constrain emissions, baseline scenarios, lead to pathways ranging between RCP 6.0 and RCP 8.5. RCP 2.6 is representative of a scenario that aims to keep global warming likely below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial temperatures. The RCPs are consistent with a wide range of scenarios in the literature as assessed by Working Group 3.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the conference today. It's great to see this event booked out, which we would expect of an event of this significance, and fantastic to have so many of the artists involved in the exhibition also speaking today. Since writing, researching, thinking, being involved in activism and movements is a part of so many of their practices. So in many ways, this conference is the flip side or continuation or expansion of the exhibition itself upstairs. So I begin by thanking all the artists who've participated in this exhibition, and especially all the artists who will be participating in today's event, along with all the other guest speakers that will frame our discussions today. This exhibition is the second time we've curated an exhibition with TJ Demos. The first was Uneven Geographies, Art and Globalization in 2010. And it was always TJ's and I's hope that there could be some kind of follow-up. And in the interim, TJ's research has taken a particularly ecological turn, as has so much alter globalization thinking. And the publishing of his third text edition on contemporary art and political ecology in a way suggested a whole new way of thinking about a sequel to Uneven Geographies. In the meantime, we've also held ecologically significant exhibitions by Piero Geladi from Turin and John Newling from Nottingham. So at Nottingham Contemporary, we feel this is very much belongs to a kind of run of thinking that will continue through our program, and that in many ways exemplifies a wider aim we have for the institution, which is to see art as an occasion for the discussion, the debate of absolutely critical issues in the public sphere. And I can't think of an exhibition that is and will do that to a greater extent than Rights of Nature. From our first conversations about this exhibition, it became important to TJ and us to, what quickly became maybe a mechanism by which to build this would be to kind of think of the various crises brought on by climate change and our economic system in terms of the Western Hemisphere. And the reasons for those are multifold, and I won't preempt them all. But I think that clearly the example and leadership of indigenous people in current ecological movements and alliances with the broader left is particularly prevalent in the Western Hemisphere, and has even, of course, reached governmental levels with the enshrinement of Rights of Mother Earth legislation in Bolivia's and Ecuador's legal systems for all the actual problems on the ground and contradictions and anti-ecological development initiatives that have continued in those nations. And and I suppose the World People's Conference on climate change in Cochabamba in Bolivia very much represents a kind of high watermark of an indigenous, socialist, and developing world perspective on ecological crisis. And I think also what this bears out in the exhibition, although it's coordinates are more geographical than historical, I think it's significant that there are a number of geohistorical perspectives that arise as you go through the exhibition, and which I think all have to do essentially with the suddenness of the confrontation between a European anthropocentric worldview and a worldview that sees the human as part of the vast continuum of life. The very fact of the Atlantic Ocean meant that confrontation was sudden and of great violence, while in terms of the histories of Europe, Asia, and Africa together, these confrontations are far more gradual, overlapping, happen over a great deal of time. I think it's also significant that despite the focus on Americas, that this is happening in Nottingham. Not least clearly because climate change affects the whole world, but of course the Industrial Revolution was invented in Britain, and climate change is as a result of accumulative emissions as well as being about current levels of carbon emissions. And in fact, the Industrial Revolution was invented, speaking even more locally, very, very close to here, immediately to our west and north in Derbyshire, the neighboring county, and the Derwent Valley, where the mechanizing factory system was first invented. And to kind of close the loop, it's, I think, also significant that the Anthropocene Working Group is chaired by Jan Zalasiewicz. And so that whole discussion, which is in process, is in fact led from Leicester, the city immediately to our south. So somehow there's great local significance as well to these global issues and how they impact, how they play out in the Americas. And I think this is borne out by the presence of a number of activist groups from Nottingham and a wider area here today, who I know will be involved in our public program over the course of the exhibition. So I'd also, while I'm here, like to thank Irene Aristizabal, who co-curated the exhibition with us, our head of exhibitions, and specifically brought her knowledge of the Colombian art scene to bear on the artist selection and the thinking behind it, and worked very closely with a number of the artists on the realization of their projects, and has managed the overall production of the exhibition. So thanks as ever to Irene and her team. And also particularly today, Jim Brower, our AV technician, who is really in charge of making all this happen, technologically speaking. It's being streamed, it's being archived. So we look forward to the conversations today having a long life and a dispersed life. And then, of course, our public programs team, now headed by Jana Graham, who essentially conceived the structure of this event with TJ and with the panelists, particularly those chairing the various sections, and also Emma Moore, assistant curator of public programs, for also enabling today's event to happen. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to TJ, who will introduce the conference. TJ is soon to be professor in the history of art and visual culture in Santa Cruz, in the visual culture department, and director of the Center for Creative Ecologies. He now has a very long title, I skipped a line, at the University of California in Santa Cruz. So our loss in London and Britain is California's gain. Prior to this recent appointment in 2015, he was reader in the Department of Art History, University College London, since 2005. He writes on contemporary art and politics. In 2013, he guest edited the special issue of Third Text, number 120, on the subject of contemporary art and political ecology. He's no stranger, as I've said, because this is the second time he's curated an exhibition here. In fact, he's kind of unique as a guest curator, having curated more than one exhibitions here. And he's currently finishing a new book entitled Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art in the Age of Climate Change. So thank you, and I introduce TJ Demos.
Thanks very much, Alex. And let's see, it's a great pleasure to be here and to have had the opportunity to organize an exhibition like this, which has become, as Alex mentioned, so central to my research, and what I'm convinced of is really a crucial, important topic of our time. And I'm afraid we may be starting the conference late, and maybe that's only appropriate for engaging, climate change in an exhibition. We can only do so at this late moment, but at least we're doing it. And I think it's really increasingly important every day not to waste any time and to move on and address this topic. So I'd like to thank Nottingham Contemporary, Alex and Irene and the whole team here. It's been an amazing experience again to work with everyone, and it's a great privilege that I'm very thankful for, to be able to be part of this exhibition project. And thanks everyone for coming. So I'm going to move right on right now to give a conceptual framework for the exhibition and the kind of issues that it's engaging with. I apologize in advance if this is it's going to be about 15 minutes, so it might put us a little bit over the top. So in the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change's fifth assessment synthesis report from 2014, which was being read as you entered into the auditorium today in Amy Balkin's performance piece included in the Rights of Nature show in the conference. And I'd like to thank all the readers. People are going to be progressively reading the synthesis report throughout the day during the intervals. So in that report, we learn that, quote, continued emission of greenhouse gases will cause further warming and long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasing the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystems. As we've heard repeatedly in the last few years, and more than that, from global scientific consensus, we're headed toward a series of tipping points which, when crossed, and hopefully they will not be, will bring a catastrophic future of the destruction of life-supporting natural environments and with it potential civilizational collapse. As we entered the so-called Anthropocene, an historically unprecedented geological era when human activity determines Earth's natural systems, the dark irony is that this new epoch is named after a species, ours, that is driving geology toward a state inhospitable to our very survivability. There is thus an urgent need to change course and to realize a radically different world. I'm just going to show you some images along with my presentation. This is the IPCC report, which is available online. You can freely download it. So there's an urgent need to change course and to realize a radically different world, one released from centuries of domination of nature, a nature historically relegated to the status of natural resources, available to infinite exploitation. That exploitation, going back to the very origins of Western civilization, as Karl Marx reminds us in his early study of classical Greek ecology, that exploitation has accelerated during post-Enlightenment modernity, and as we know, accompanied a colonialism that violently internalized people as colonial subjects or eliminated them from the reigning order and dispossessed them of their lands and their relationship to a pre-colonial nature, afterward made to serve the epic project of primitive accumulation over the last 500 years. That history, where political ecology is integrally connected to colonial history, has set the stage for the obscene wealth inequalities of the present day. When we learn, for instance, according to a recent Oxfam report, that the world's richest 80 people own as much as the bottom half of the population combined, roughly 3.5 billion people, just as a similar number of corporations is largely responsible for running the fossil fuel economy. This situation has led to the need for what some have termed the Great Transition, as discussed, for instance, by Naomi Klein in her recent book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. It refers first and foremost to a necessary transformation that will eliminate the causes of catastrophic climate change, and more broadly, a shift in our political economy away from the fetishization of growth beyond all else, a new energy system, a new democracy, and new relationships to the earth and to each other, for land, food, and water sovereignty, for indigenous and human rights, and dignity for all of which turn ecology into a complex and integral project. Needless to say, such a vision runs counter to the prevailing doctrine of green capitalism, which believes that environmental crisis can only be solved through further market mechanisms, carbon offset credits, debt for nature swaps, ethical consumerism, green design, financializing nature, and so on, according to which we find the very cause of our catastrophic conditions repeatedly and falsely offered as the only possible solution. But how to bring about this great transition, no doubt massively challenging in political terms alone? And here the legal invention of rights of nature provides one key mechanism which presents nothing less than a cultural, social, and political revolution in jurisprudence, and more broadly, in philosophical worldview, one moving away from a property-based conception of nature toward a biocentric integration in which legal standing and personhood are extended to non-human agents. Right? If corporations can be called persons, why not nature? As such, it proposes a mechanism to hold industry, whether agriculture or logging or mining or farming or fishing, accountable for what are currently considered their externalities, that is, the negative environmental and social impacts their activities generate, but from which they're currently able to renounce all responsibility. We'll soon hear more about earth jurisprudence from the South African attorney Cormac Cullinan and from Karine Nadal of the Gaia Foundation and Tom Brennan of Wildlaw UK. But before addressing what this shift relationship to the diverse artistic and activist practices presented in the show, which I'll do in a couple minutes, I'd like first to make a few quick observations about rights of nature's conceptual basis. It's important to point out, first of all, that rights of nature is no simple Western legal development, as Alex mentioned, but is one embedded in long histories of indigenous movements in the Americas, movements that situate rights of nature or rights of Pachamama, or Mother Nature, or Mother Earth, within diverse cultural traditions related to what is commonly termed buen vivir in Spanish, or living well, as in Andean cultures of South America, including Bolivia and Ecuador, Peru, and parts of Colombia. In Quechuan, suma cauce, or buen vivir, defines a form of life counter to Western development-based economies and its growth paradigm, that of corporate globalization, or NAFTA policies of the World Bank and the WTO, including current TTIP proposals to draw Europe into the sphere of ever greater multinational corporate power. Buen vivir instead emphasizes the priorities of community organization, self-determination, political autonomy, indigenous rights, and living well according to a harmonious relation to nature, the environment traditionally being the location of sacredness according to Amerindian, Mesoamerican, and North American indigenous cosmologies. So when Bolivia and Ecuador institutionalized the rights of nature in their constitutions and legal systems to protect environments from industrial destruction, as they did beginning in 2008. And when the International Rights of Nature Tribunal, including people like the Indian eco-activist Vandana Shiva, Cormac Cullinan, the Ecuadorian Quechua leader Blanca Chancoso, the Ecuadorian economist Alberto Acosta, and Tom Goldtooth of the Diné Dakota nations, among others. When that tribunal initiates hearings against Condor mining in Ecuador, or BP's 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, or Chevron Texaco activities in Ecuador, or oil drilling in Ecuador's Yasuni National Park, and hydraulic fracturing in Argentina, and when the World's Peoples Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth, meeting in 2010 in Cochabamba, Bolivia, articulated their proposal for a universal declaration of the rights of Mother Earth, copies of which you can see in the show, in which it's written, Mother Earth is a unique, indivisible, self-regulating community of interrelated beings that sustains, contains, and reproduces all beings. In all of these various articulations, we find a repeated emphasis upon the fact that rights of nature discourse has deep roots in indigenous culture and religious traditions. This recognition, however, does not mean that embracing buen vivir, or positioning rights of nature as a viable counter-narrative to Western developmentalism, means returning to some idealized pre-Columbian origin. Rather, as many critical commentators make clear, living well emerges as a decolonizing project currently constructed at the convergence of indigenous activism, environmentalist social movements, earth-centric legal philosophy, and human and non-human rights claims, all closely networked in solidarity and open to local and regional particularities. In other words, this designates what might be called an intersectionalist politics of plurinational communities, and interdisciplinary actors and interspecies agents, founded in centuries of dispossession and struggles for justice, and directed currently against corporate globalization and its ongoing colonization of nature. In retaining the term nature in our title, Rights of Nature, we're in effect declaring, I think, an allegiance to this intersectionalist politics, one that declines, in other words, the speculative realist proposal within philosophy, within philosophical discourse, to abandon the term nature altogether, as sociologist philosopher Bruno Latour and the eco-critic Tom Morton, among others, have suggested, in favor of, for them, a post-natural condition, or an ecology without nature. While nature is surely a complex term and has historically reinforced patterns of ideological naturalization and supported objectifying ontological divisions between humans and nature, this is why people object to the term, as if nature exists as a pure realm apart from the human, what we need is not, we would argue, terminological abandonment, but rather conceptual reinvention, as we find in Rights of Nature discourse. So this conceptual reinvention of nature, moreover, should also bear in mind warnings concerning the Western academies and also museum discourse, cultural discourse at large, and the history of unacknowledged appropriations of indigenous knowledge in its theoretical inventions, particularly now in relation to non-anthropocentric philosophy or object-oriented ontology and notions of ecological interdependence with non-humans, the conceptual origins of which can also be traced in the long histories of diverse First Nations, cultural, and religious traditions. As Canadian Indigenous feminist Zoe Todd has recently reminded us, it's important to avoid the situation whereby first, in her words, first they came for the land, the water, the wood, the furs, bodies, the gold, and now they take our laws, our stories, our philosophies. So rather than claiming conceptual originality, we need more complex genealogies that register the significance of indigenous contributions to these concepts as a methodology of intellectual and political allegiance. For if not, what neo-colonial violence is done when Slavoj Žižek imperiously declares there is no Mother Earth watching over us? Or when the philosopher Alain Badiou claims that, quote, the rights of nature is a contemporary form of the opium of the people. Yet despite the suppression of indigenous wisdom in such voices, these detractors do point out a crucial challenge to rights of nature, as did David Harvey when he moderated a recent conference on rights of nature at New York's CUNY, the City University of New York, in 2011. And that is, rights of nature risks being mere legal idealism without social movements to back it up. That was Harvey's point. Yet has this not been the case so far? Even Ecuador's and Bolivia's recent uneven track record of supporting rights of nature in the face of extraction and oil drilling projects has been contested at every turn by indigenous activism and international environmental struggles. If anything, rights of nature has indeed been propelled forward and been backed up at every turn by the energies of interconnected social movements, such as Canada's Idle No More, which, in their words, seeks to assert indigenous inherent rights to sovereignty and reinstitute traditional laws and nation-to-nation treaties by protecting the lands and waters from corporate destruction, and which welcomes international solidarity campaigns. How then, finally, might visual culture, artistic and activist practices contribute further to these intersectionalist politics and these ontological terms and indigenous social movements, and that great transition to realize new forms of life by recognizing the rights of nature? The ambition of the exhibition and also the conference and the public programming events that will continue during the length of the exhibition in the next 7 weeks. And I encourage you to look at that schedule, because there's some amazing speakers and events planned that will help to provide more forums in which this, the exhibition's subject matter can be investigated. So the ambition of the exhibition is to open pathways into experimental artistic engagements with the cultural, philosophical, speculative, political, and legal aspects of the paradigm shift signaled by rights of nature. Some of the exhibition's inclusions, for instance, directly address the situated practices and stakeholder communities and socio-political and economic conflicts around this ongoing legal transformation, as in Ursula Biemann's and Paulo Tavares's project, Forest Law. Doing so as well in multiple geographies, from the Arctic to Central and South America, through video and photography, documentary and essayistic portrayals of court cases, and presenting forensic evidence, maps, texts, and other related material testimony. While other contributions you'll find are rather more allegorical and speculative, as in Fernando Palma's project, only indirectly related to earth jurisprudence and rather creatively investigating the perceptual and affective terms of non-anthropocentric relations to non-human subjects and environments, the visual culture of indigenous cosmopolitics, or even the animistic transcendence of subject-object and human nature oppositions. Still other inclusions examine the ecocidal circumstances of fossil fuel capitalism, such as in the Center for Land Use Interpretation's topographic overview of oil development in the Texas area of Houston, as well as its human, animal, and environmental costs, and invoke the recycled wreckage of colonial histories of dispossession and violence, sometimes with biting wit and poignant irony. There are also references in the show to existing models of communities practicing environmental sustainability and cultural self-determination, from the Gwich'in people of Alaska to the Mayan Zapatistas of Chiapas, models that are by no means examples of romantic Indian environmentalism, but rather internationally networked post-colonial struggles for survival amidst continuing neoliberal onslaughts, including the onslaughts of GM agribusiness and pharmaceutical biopiracy, fossil fuel extractivism, and ongoing land grabs. We'll hear more specifically about these diverse artistic practices throughout the day and their multiple creative and critical engagements with rights of nature. So lastly, as a self-styled research exhibition, Rights of Nature hopes to map diverse artistic trajectories and propose connections to a larger conceptual scaffolding that individual inclusions will inevitably surpass and transcend, as none are limited to the show's conceptual terms. Still, we hope to contribute to a growing platform of collective learning regarding this vibrant confluence of political commitments and artistic experiments, theoretical positions, legal institutions, and collective struggles in indigenous movements. Just as the International Rights of Nature Tribunal represents a modeling of Earth jurisprudence for prospective realization at different political scales, at the local, regional, national, and global scales, so the exhibition offers a performance of the decolonization of nature that glimpses potential futures freed from environmental exploitation and anthropocentric domination. As such, we aim to further energize the larger struggle toward a transitional political ecology, one that opens alternatives for critical pedagogy in the environmental arts and humanities, and in cultural discourse at large, and that works toward establishing our future survival, where our is extended to Earth's diverse living communities within a world of environmental justice, sustainability, and rights of nature. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the presentation of Cormac Cullinan and representatives of the Gaia Foundation and Wild Law. So let me give a very brief introduction to the speakers, and then we'll invite Cormac to give his presentation. So Cormac Cullinan is a practicing environmental attorney and author based in Cape Town, South Africa. He was a former anti-apartheid activist, and he's practiced, taught, and written about environmental law and policy since 1992, and has worked in more than 20 countries and has drafted many environmental treaties and legislation and policies. He was involved in the proposal for the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. And he wrote the text called Wild Law, published in 1992, that has been so formative for much of the activity and movements and political activism that have come out in the last decade or so. So, Cormac, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. I'm just going to introduce the two other speakers, then we'll turn to your presentation. So following Cormac will be Tom Brennan, who's a lawyer and has worked for a number of years primarily providing assistance to communities with environmental concerns. And he's with Wild Law UK, and his involvement in Wild Law began in 2006. And he's on the Wild Law UK Steering Committee since 2011. And then we'll also hear from Karine Nadal, who works for the Gaia Foundation as an Earth Law Support Officer, providing legal research and advocacy support to indigenous communities, particularly in Africa, for the revival, practice, and legal recognition of customary governance systems based on Earth jurisprudence and Earth law principles. So we'll have the presentation, and then we'll have a period of question and answer immediately following. So I'll turn it over to Cormac now. Thanks so much, Cormac, for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you very much, DJ. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you, albeit long distance. But I think it's tremendously inspiring to be sitting here at the southern tip of Africa, speaking to you in the UK and discussing many issues which originate and have been taken forward in Latin America. I think this is a very clear and good example of what's happening with this movement and how exciting it's become. What I'd like to do is talk briefly about Earth democracy and wild law, a necessary utopia. By utopia here, I mean a future condition that we aspire to, not something which is unattainable. But just before I start, I think we sit at this moment in a peculiarly significant period in the history of humanity. At the moment, the cultures that dominate the world believe that human beings are separate from and superior to the rest of the planet, to nature, if you like. They believe that there is a radical discontinuity between the human species and everything else, and effectively that different laws apply to us. We are above nature, if you like, and that the best way for human beings to prosper is to exploit and dominate nature. Now, in my view, the understanding that human beings are separate from nature is completely untenable, both from a scientific perspective and from the perspective of all the great wisdom traditions throughout history. The fact is that we are such an integral part of the whole. The molecules that flow through us as we breathe and eat and move around flow through the plants and the earth, and we are absolutely part of the whole, so much so that we are more accurately understood as an aspect of earth rather than anything completely distinct from it. Even if one doesn't take it to that degree, it's quite clear that the human being cannot survive without its habitat. We are nourished by our habitat, by earth, and we cannot exist without it. So there is a very tangible reality to the fact that we are part of this community of life that we call Earth. Now, that means that the idea that we are separate from and superior to Earth is a kind of an illusion or delusion. One cannot hold both positions at the same time. Either we're part of the whole or we're separate from it. Now, the idea that we are separate from Earth and that our well-being is best achieved by exploiting the Earth is what I sometimes call a colonial philosophy, the idea that you can come to a place, exploit it, degrade it, and then leave. But of course, we cannot leave. This is the planet in which we've evolved. We are Earthlings, and we don't make sense anywhere else in the universe, even though a few of us may be able to survive for short periods of relatively short periods of time elsewhere. So if that is the case, the crucial transition we need to make, our species needs to make at this time, is to abandon those delusions and to begin to live in accordance with the reality that we are members of this community of life, the most extraordinary, beautiful, complex, and amazing community of life we've been able to discover anywhere in the entire universe. And to celebrate that fact, and if we want to remain part of that community, then we must play by the rules of that community. That is the rule of any community. We need to respect the other members of the community and work out ways of living harmoniously together, because each member of the community, each being that has come into being, everything that exists, has their specific role to play in contributing to the completeness and the integrity and the functioning of the whole. Everything matters. So the idea of Earth jurisprudence, a philosophy of law which is not anthropocentric but focused on the whole, biocentric, if you will, is simply that instead of designing our legal and political systems to legitimate and perpetuate the domination of Earth, in other words, instead of designing them from a colonial mindset, we would change the purpose of law and governance so that it enables us to live as good members of the community and facilitates our cohabitation in harmony with the other members of the community. So from this perspective, the most important thing is to maintain the health and integrity of the whole, in the same way as it's important to retain the health and integrity of the whole body for individual cells to be healthy. There is no sense in trying to look after one particular cell at the expense of the body, which provides the context and the habitat for that cell to survive. So wild laws then would be laws which are consistent with this philosophical approach. But before I go further, I'd like to just explain a little bit about what I mean by wildness. Because for me, if we look at our planet and its long evolutionary history, it's quite clear that there's some extraordinarily creative force which is driving this process. If we think about the fact that our planet originated from the debris of the explosion of a massive star called Tiamat, and it was gradually spun into the planets, and then over time a system of order arose. Initially, what happened on our planet was determined primarily by the radiation of the sun, but eventually you had this extraordinary event when life emerged, and then the plants and bacteria started changing the composition of the planet, of the atmosphere, etc. And today you see this extraordinary profusion of life, all integrally related. So it's quite evident that creativity is at the heart of the universe, that there's some extraordinary creative force that flows through everything. And for me, that is the force of wildness. It is that which is untamed, that which is to some extent unpredictable, but deeply creative. It is the opposite of the controlled monocultures of the mind which contemporary cultures seek to put in place. So from my perspective, the struggle that we are involved in is very, very closely allied to the artistic expression. I think that artists and cultural activists are, by their very nature, very close to these ideas, because we all know that you need to retain that closeness to your imaginative, wild side, if you like, to retain your creativity. So for me, wildness is that extraordinary force, that golden thread that ties human nature back, it travels back through time and connects us with the greater nature. It is that part of us which is essentially in line with the forces of the universe and enables those forces to flow through us. So the idea of a wild law would be a law which would be consistent with that, a law which's main purpose is to enable us to live harmoniously and as a fully connected members of this community of life, rather than to alienate us, dissociate ourselves from it. And to just give you one example of what I'm talking about, law, in the eyes of the law, everything on the planet and the planet itself, everything that is not a human being or a corporation, is defined as property. Now, property is a thing. It is not a subject, and is accordingly incapable of holding rights. So one of the advantages of using the language of rights of nature is that it immediately puts this crucial philosophical discussion on the table, because for a traditional lawyer, the idea that nature could have rights is ridiculous, because self-evidently property cannot have rights. The point of this, of course, is to challenge those fundamental assumptions, because all that has come into being from the Earth jurisprudence perspective has the right to be, the right to a place to be or a habitat, and the right to continue playing its role in the evolutionary processes of the Earth. In other words, to play its function within the completion of the whole. So that is why the rights of nature approach, wild law approach, presents a fundamental challenge to not just existing laws and legal systems, but to the underlying philosophies and worldviews which dominate in the world today. And as you've heard, although there are many strands which have come together in forming what is now the global rights of nature or rights of Mother Earth movement, a particularly important part has been played by the countries of Latin America, and particularly the Andean countries. And I'd like to just quote, you've heard already about the concept of el buen vivir or summa causa, living well. And to quote Leonardo Boff, the leading liberation theologist and also a member of the Council of the Earth Charter, he wrote an interesting article called The Latin American Contribution to Geosociety in 2011. And he talked about the concept of living well as the process of life in its plenitude, as a deep, rounded concept. And he said that it involves a number of components. It involves knowing how to live well. And that is certainly something which contemporary societies have by and large forgotten. And he distinguishes very carefully between living well and living better, because many of us attempt to live better than our neighbors. And of course, that is a never-ending struggle. It is insatiable. As soon as one gets one up on your neighbor, then they need to live better than you, and it cannot be satisfied. He also talks about knowing how to coexist with others. And again, this is one of our fundamental challenges. Our normal response to any other member of the community that we see as inimical to us or who don't fit in with our worldview, whether they be baboons living on the mountains here in Cape Town or bacteria, is to kill them. So we wage war on insects, etc. And what we've got to do is find out how to coexist with the other beings on this planet, and that is not an easy task. He also comments in relation to living well that it cannot be imagined without community, that this is a concept which is essentially about relatedness and interrelationship and interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say. So it is something which we need to be conscious of at all times, that this is something which is not only about the individual, but also about the collective. And it leads to of a community which is not just human, but of the whole Earth, what Vandana Shiva would call an Earth democracy. And as Leonardo Boff has pointed out, this goes beyond the mere representative or participatory democracy models that have developed largely in Europe, and it includes the whole community of life, nature, and Mother Earth itself. So how do we establish systems of self-regulation, of regulating human beings, which recognize that we are embedded in this wider community of life? One of the things that it seems to me is essential to any such community, to any such philosophy, is a recognition of the rights of nature. In my own country, South Africa, for a long period of time, as you know, there was a system of apartheid, and that was basically, apartheid is the Afrikaans word for separateness. And it was based fundamentally on the idea that the best way for a small community of white people to flourish and prosper was to deny the rest of the community rights and to exploit them. And the society soon reached an impasse and began deteriorating. And the only way to go forward was to recognize that we are all part of the same community and recognize rights for all. Now, I think that's analogous to what we're talking about here, except now we're talking about expanding the concept of community, our recognition of it, to embrace the reality that it is far, far wider than human beings. So, as you've heard, one of the important aspects of this was the proclamation of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, which was proclaimed as a people's document. It calls upon the United Nations to adopt it, but nobody's holding their breath for that to happen. The 35,000 or more people at the Cochabamba conference took it upon themselves to proclaim the declaration. It has its power. It obtains its power from the fact that it is a people's document. It expresses the aspirations and beliefs of an enormous number of people, with particular impetus from the indigenous communities, because the indigenous communities of Latin America, many of them do not have a word in their native languages for rights. So initially it was very strange for them to use these terms, but after discussion they accepted that what the Universal Declaration is doing is expressing their worldview translated into a language that the international community can understand, the international language of rights and law, etc. So in that sense, the Universal Declaration reflects indigenous cosmologies which would be familiar to indigenous peoples throughout the world, not just in the Andean region. And the subsequent growth of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and the worldwide movement in this regard has to some extent been influenced by the philosophy that in these times, particularly where it's very urgent to change quickly because of climate change, we can't spend all of our energy simply fighting the existing system. We need to get on with the job of building the societies that we want right now. And in this regard, I particularly like the quote from Buckminster Fuller, who said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. You change something, to change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And one of the most exciting things about being involved in this work is seeing the new worldview emerging as the cracks in the existing system widen, like green shoots driving up through tarmac. And one of the examples that I'll touch on is the Tribunal for the Rights of Mother Earth that we've established. It's held hearings in Quito in Ecuador, and recently at the climate change talks in Lima in Peru, and it'll meet again in Paris. But there have also been regional hearings in Australia, in the Bay Area of the United States, and other places. Now, what this is the emergence of a new structure of international governance. It's quite clear if one follows the climate change talks that we are never going to get the kind of very strong, decisive action that we need to successfully address the challenge of climate change through the UNFCCC talks. There are simply too many vested interests, too much horse trading, and it's just too complex. In fact, if one looks at the commitments, they're going backwards, not forwards. So what is to be done? Well, we don't need the permission of governments to start working on the issue. We as a people can simply start building the society that we want to. And one of the aims of the tribunal is to show that if decisions were made in accordance with the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, how different the outcomes would be. It shows very clearly what activities which are currently lawful would be regarded as impermissible and unlawful, and the kind of actions that should be taken to redress it. So it's an attempt to show the world that this is not simply an abstract utopia. It's quite possible to have such tribunals that can make these decisions and that would produce outcomes which are far more preferable and effective than the current outcomes. And of course, as you've heard, it has not been without its problems. For example, in both Bolivia and Ecuador, where rights for nature is enshrined in law, and particularly Ecuador, where it's in the constitution, the governments have, to some extent, moved away from the promises. And for example, in Ecuador, which I know best, the current president, Rafael Correa, recently announced that he was going to permit oil extraction from the Yasuni National Park. Now, this is an extraordinary situation. Ecuador is arguably the most biodiverse country in the world. The Yasuni National Park is probably one of the most biodiverse parts of Ecuador, and is also very sensitive. A lot of the forest floods periodically. It is also not only a national park, but there are also at least 2 uncontacted indigenous tribes in that area. And it's pretty much the worst place in the world at which you could start oil extraction. So there has been a backlash, and this is to some extent driven by the fact that the government of Ecuador borrowed money from the Chinese to finance roads, etc., which helped them win elections. And some of that money has been used for social projects. So making this kind of transition is not easy. But why it is a necessary utopia is because that is the price of long-term survival on this planet. Either we fit in or we will be excluded from the community of life. And this is not a terrible burden. The privilege of being born into this community of life is probably the greatest privilege that I can think of in the universe. And we are sitting at a situation where if instead of fighting to hold on to the old ways, we embrace the challenge of completely reconceptualizing every aspect of our civilizations, reconceiving the role of the human being within this community of life, and the possibility, the potential exists for an extraordinarily creative period of human history, because it is, of course, as you know, it's often said that necessity is the mother of invention. Well, right now we have the mother of necessity, and that can drive extraordinarily creativity. It could drive a kind of green renaissance, a cultural renaissance, the likes of which haven't been seen on this planet for an awful long time. And what has been very encouraging is, even though governments like that of President Correa have attempted to roll back or not implement the constitutional rights, in response, the people have risen up, and the Yasunidos, young people who came together and gathered more than 850,000 signatures to protect the Yasuni National Park, who opinion polls show that 60% of Ecuadorians are in favor of the Yasunidos and support them, 30% don't, and 10% are undecided. And that's extraordinary. It's happened in a very short period of time, and it really gives you a sense of what's happening in the world as this transition begins to happen. So I think that we live in extraordinary times, and I think that the challenge is to embrace the challenge of change, the challenge of reintegrating ourselves in the fullest possible way into this community of life, and not to forget community. We need to work together to achieve this, because the forces of the retrogressive forces, the status quo, are significant. But if you look around you in the room where you're sitting right now, I'm willing to bet that sitting among you are the nucleus of many such communities. In other words, there are communities of people, you already exist, people who share ideas, who share a commitment to this better world, and who are excited and inspired, and whose creative juices begin to flow when faced with a challenge of this magnitude, and something which is deeply rewarding. This work is not just about fighting harm to the planet. That is a very important part of this work, but it is also about engaging in literally recreating our concept of what it means to be human and what our societies could be, and to maximize the potential of the human being, because surely our future can only lie with the planet as members of this community of life, and not as alienated colonial masters that seek to degrade and dominate and destroy. So it's wonderful to be able to speak to all of you, and I hope that you that your conference is extraordinarily productive, and that in my mind, it's completely part of this work, and it's lovely to see creative people coming together around these ideas. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cormac. We're going to turn to Tom now to give the next presentation. Then we'll have Karine, and then we'll have a question and answer. If you can stay with us for that, that would be great. Okay.
Hello, good morning. My name is Tom Brennan from Wildlaw UK. Very excited to be here. Very interesting from a lawyer's perspective to see rights of nature emblazoned on the side of a building this morning, and I understand there are posters all around the city, so I hope the exhibition is a great success. It's wonderful to be able to explore different explore it from different aspects. I'm here to tell you a little bit about Wildlaw UK and its work. I think particularly from a UK perspective, it's very clear that we're all aware that there are a number of environmental problems, and here in the UK we had the State of Nature report at the end of last year, which highlighted that over 60% of our species, of the species that they studied, are in decline, have been in decline over the last 50 years. 31% of those have been declining strongly. Now, it's not as if we don't have environmental laws. As an environmental lawyer, I'm very aware of them. We have a great variety of law and regulation. But I think a lot of the problems are stemming from the fact that, as Cormac has previously touched on, all of our kind of governance systems are coming from a very much a sort of human-centered perspective, an anthropocentric perspective. There is a disconnect between us and the environment. We are here, we see the environment there. We see ourselves apart from it rather than part of it. So we see it very much in terms of resources for us to be used. And even where we do have now, from a sort of governmental political spectrum point of view, the idea of human well-being and a slightly more holistic approach is being taken. They still talk in terms of ecosystem services, which is, again, a resource-based concept and looking at things from a monetary value. So Cormac mentioned the term Earth jurisprudence. Now, the term Earth jurisprudence was coined by a geologian and cultural historian, Thomas Berry, who sadly passed away. But he said that there was a need to re-envisage our governance systems, putting Earth back at the centre. And in fact, at the risk of quoting Cormac in front of Cormac, in his Wildlaw book, he said one of the most important things he learned from Thomas Berry was that the essential purpose of human governance systems should be to support people to play a mutually enhancing role within the wider community of life on Earth. So and the idea that if Earth is effectively the source of law, that's where we get our rights from. If we have rights, then other species should have rights. Why is that? That's something which has been discussed. The Professor Christopher Stone raised the question back in 1972, should trees have standing, in the sense of should trees be able to be represented in law. And looking back slightly further, Aldo Leopold in 1949, with regard to our relationship with the Earth in the Sand County Almanac, had said that we abuse the land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see the land as a community to which we belong, then we may begin to use it with love and respect. And I think that's echoed in Thomas Berry's comment that we should, instead of seeing the universe as a collection of objects, we should instead see it as more of a communion of subjects. So there's very much this kind of separateness, idea of separateness that we are coming up against time and time again. And just to pause for a moment, we are in an art gallery, and the idea that this idea of separateness struck me a couple of years ago. There were two more mainstream, sort of high-profile British artists that were in an exhibition in London shortly after one another, Damien Hirst and David Hockney. And on viewing those two exhibitions, I was struck by the fact that Damien Hirst, who of course is famous for putting animals in, displaying them in cases in formaldehyde, was taking a very scientific, cold, separate approach to his subjects, whereas in David Hockney's paintings there was a real exuberance, a real excitement of his kind of joy and awe at trying to capture the May blossom as it emerged on the hedgerows around him. But back to wild law. So the origins of wild law in the UK, I think, can be traced back to the Gaia Foundation, and you'll hear from Corinne in a moment about the work that they do. And they had been instrumental in the early discussions with Thomas Berry. And back in 2005, Gaia came together with the UK Environmental Law Association, UKLA as they're termed, which is a professional body of environmental lawyers working to make the law work for a better environment, and the Environmental Law Foundation, who work with charities here in the UK who are facing threats to their environment and quality of life. Now, they ran a series of conferences and weekend workshops. In fact, Cormac participated in some of the early ones to kind of explore the ideas and broaden the discussions a bit further. And that led to the production of a wild law report back in 2009-2010, which looked at for evidence of wild law in jurisdictions around the world. I think New Zealand came off best. They have a National Parks Act which was recognised the value of a park from its sort of intrinsic, the intrinsic worth of a park. It's fair to say everywhere else there was slight evidence, but not very much. And additionally, alongside this, UKLA also run a series of events in Scotland, which still continue. Small groups of lawyers go off into wild places to discuss wild law. But back in 2010, out of the conferences, there was a feeling that there was a need for a separate organisation to try and campaign for wild law. We use the term wild law or earth law. And 2011, Wild Law UK was formed. Now we have, Wild Law UK have two main aims. One is to secure the rights of nature in law and policy, such that wild law and rights of nature principles are embedded in our legal system. And the second is to promote the understanding that humans are part of, not separate from, from nature, so that they inherently behave in ways that are in harmony with the earth. And the idea being that such an understanding will encourage people to work to enhance the whole earth system rather than undermine it. So there are two main strands, and we talk about them in terms of, we have the law and policy or strand, and the behaviour strand, or if you like, the head and the heart. So just to talk a little bit about each of those in turn in terms of the work that we've done and are doing, the law and policy side. We have, over the years, contributed to a number of consultations on a variety of things. The UN conference in Rio, for example. Here in the UK, there were consultations on the Bill of Rights, National Planning Policy Framework, biodiversity offsetting, a whole kind of range of different things, really trying to feed in those wild law ideas. Now, consultations can be frustrating at the best of times, so clearly that's not the only way you're going to get anywhere at all, but they are an important part, I think, of a democratic process. The other thing we've been looking into is the possibility of drafting something like a Wild Law Act, along the lines perhaps of the Human Rights Act, which we would seek to get adopted by a political party, which could then be introduced as a private member's bill. Or the alternative would be to look at exploring other legal routes and principles that are available, such as the guardian principle, which is used in family cases, or where a guardian is used to represent children. But all of those kind of legal approaches will always come up against two main difficulties. One is the way in which those laws or regulations are interpreted, and that's likely to need education on the part of the judiciary and even the lawyers. So well, you could have a Wildlaw Act, but it depends how that law is interpreted, and also then enforcement, which of course Cormac touched on earlier with regard to Ecuador, and that too requires an education across the board, really. And I think one of the problems from an environmental perspective particularly is that all too often, even with the current legal system that we have, the term national or public interest is always interpreted as the national economic interest. And so from an environmental or a human rights perspective, there is usually a rider which allows those rights to be overridden. Now, Wildlaw UK recently came up against this situation itself. We are from a legal perspective, we are an unincorporated association. We're all volunteers, and we have difficulty with lack of resources, and generally speaking, we're looking to put ourselves on a more formal footing. Now, we considered this, and there is a new opportunity for small organisations to register with the Charity Commission as incorporated charitable organisations, I think the term is. And we thought that might help us in terms of putting ourselves on a firmer footing and potentially also opening some funding streams. So we made an application to the Charity Commission, and in order to be one of these ICOs, you have to demonstrate that you have charitable objectives and that you are acting for the public benefit. Now, from a charitable objectives point of view, the fact that we are seeking to change the law was always going to be a bit tricky because that's seen as political, and you can't be a political party can't be a charity. However, the second reason is perhaps more surprising. Because we'd stated that our objectives were for the benefit of the public and the environment, the Charity Commission said that we were our objectives were for the benefit of something other than the public, and therefore we were disqualified. So that's a great example, really, of how our current system fails to recognise that the public benefit clearly will rely on the need for a healthy environment. The second strand of our work, the behaviour strand, is obviously linked to the first. But I think whereas the first is talking more about the kind of the governmental, the high-level stuff, you're trying to get changes in law, the second behaviour can be at that level as well, but also much more from the grassroots. And I think that's where we all have a responsibility. And we need to kind of think about how our actions are affecting the integrity of the wider Earth community. So we have... building on the workshops and the conferences that have took place previously, we have taken the opportunity to outreach, to go out to other organisations and events that and take the wildlaw message to areas that it may not be that you may not expect to see us. So we've been in a variety of places like the resurgence camps and. I think that the best place was the Wilderness Festival was quite an interesting one. Trying to get that message across and trying to get people to take action. We've most recently done an Awakening the Dreamer symposium back in October, and which was a method introduced by the Pachamama Alliance, and are also exploring the possibility of Cormac mentioned the tribunal, whether we may be able to do something along those lines over here. Now, I'm running out of time, so I just mentioned that there are several initiatives that have emerged from the UK, which I won't have time to tell you about, but I will just flag them up briefly. One is the Eradicating Ecocide initiative, which you may well have come across, which was introduced by Barrister Polly Higgins, which is now spreading across the world, which is looking at introducing, making ecocide the fifth crime against peace. The second is a campaign to introduce a European citizens' initiative on the rights of nature that's been introduced by the International Centre for Holistic Law. That's looking effectively using the European process. So that would be looking at introducing a European directive, which we would then implement nationally. And the third, so those are very much sort of top-down. The third is the Falkirk Community Charter. A community in Scotland were facing coal bed methane, an application for coal bed methane extraction, and they came together and used a community charter, formed a community charter, which recognised the local tangible and intangible assets that the community agreed were fundamental to the health and well-being of current and future generations. Now, that charter doesn't have legal status, but it gains its legal recognition within the planning process. It is something that has to be decided, has to be considered when a decision is being taken. Now, in that case, the decision has been called in by the Scottish ministers, and they are waiting for an announcement any time. So I will just finish by saying that it basically comes down, I think, you know, we ask governments to do things, but it does come very much down to ourselves taking action. And it's been said that humans are, with our power for self-reflection, humans are the universe reflecting on itself. Now, whether you agree with that or not, I think it's fair to say we're very aware, being as aware of our impacts that we have an obligation to act in a more mutually beneficial way. And I'll just leave you with Thomas Berry's guiding principle, which was influenced by a meadow he'd seen as a boy. And he said, whatever preserves and enhances this meadow in the natural processes of its transformation is good. Whatever opposes or negates it is not good. My life orientation is that simple. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. And now immediately right over to Karine Nadal.
Thank you very much to Nottingham Contemporary and for providing this space for reflection and to mobilise action around the rights of nature. Also, thank you to Cormac and Tom for giving the origins of Earth's jurisprudence and wild law. Today, I'd like to share some of the experiences of the communities we've been working with, accompanying, particularly in Colombia and countries in Africa, of how they've been living Earth law. To begin with, I'd like to share a short clip of a film called Sacred Voices to give an insight of how communities have been living Earth law. And it's a film by the partners of the African Biodiversity Network in collaboration with Gaia. Sorry,
then ya ire koringana porikari sigo ikarita tagentu ke wa kyongwa ke kyaringithwe kwa ke thura ta muntu borega gwa athuru nkora ke kwenkora ke etia kena nontu ndeni ya ire ekaja kwenyangwa
isu siani itu themba twithwa twithemba tukitia mbua tuyundu gepeka ambuye yuwa Pou sino ila siente ne wat que rembo ni usi kalabo le sumbe siangai na sini buni sobe kete
mavu anga ngomu zwifoni ana ndeme ngauri hapo zwifoni azvitodi uchinyadziwa haya mavu hanyaguthintiwa lushaka hange inda alukoni uchila ngauri rine riva na lutendo nga ngomu zwifoni na mavu alo
irene kuntu kwe na inyamono na ire kai tetanaira ire mwe karingithwa ire uinge no monka chi tete ko kai tetanagia
nithuraga kinya untu kwa kwena sauti nitigakuruta sauti koguo kinya cio mathugania macho ciongwa mbene
kamupo na kazwipo ndione hune rawana chirunzi nga maanḓa rine va Afrika chirunzi chashu na mbilu dzashu dzoṱhe dzi kha zwifo na mupo
gutie muntu gomba kuthondeka ire yonekire kuma ria nthiguru yombirwe na imurungu ombire ire gutie muntu gomba kurutha ire
kabira hidhamni bira malee kan inni qabu awliyaa waan jiruufi bishaan jira awliyaa waan jiruufi bosonni jira awliyaa waan jiruufi beeyladoonni bosonaa sunniin jiran simbirroonni jiran leenci jira qeerransi jira bofni jira wanni hunduu jira walitti hidhama kana waan qabuuf awliyaan ammootu bootaan awliyaa sun yoo kabadu taate namaa miti kunillee waliin bada
ngori mupo kana zwifoi ndi ifa la shango ndi mbilu ya shango
Clear from what the communities have been explaining is that what the term Earth jurisprudence, which, as Tom explained, Thomas Berry termed, is not just a legal philosophy, it's a way of life. It's a living law which the communities have been practicing for thousands of years. And it's based on a deep understanding that the whole Earth is sacred and that within the body of the Earth are sacred natural sites, very much like vital organs of the body, and they need to be protected to maintain the health and functioning of the wider whole. Earth is the source of law and order, and the communities understand that their human governance systems, their traditional knowledge, their customary laws, their human activities all need to be aligned with and comply with the laws of the Earth to maintain the health and balance of the system. The communities very much see themselves as part of nature, and we've heard from Tom and Cormac about that need for all of us to feel connected with the source of our life. And the communities uphold their role and responsibilities as custodians of their ecosystem, custodians of the sacred natural sites, and they perform rituals and ceremonies as a way of giving thanks and giving something back to nature, not just taking away. And while the term rights of nature may not be always explicit, it's very much that deep respect and for life is very much embedded in their way of life and in their thinking. And as Thomas Berry referred, it's the recognition of the right to exist, the right to habitat, and the right to fulfill one's role in the evolution of life. However, this way of life and the laws of the earth are being threatened and undermined. in the name of economic development, by particularly industrial agriculture and increasingly by mining and extractive industries. And we have the legacy of colonial laws and industrial laws which treat nature as property, a resource to be exploited, and do not see that indigenous and local peoples have rights to govern themselves, to determine their own future. And this is leading to a displacement of communities and an erosion of their traditional knowledge and practices which have been protecting the ecosystems for centuries. However, in response, communities have been embarking on a journey of rediscovery, what they called going back to roots of their culture, reconnecting with the laws of the earth. And they've been, with the support of local partners and the Gaia Foundation, have been rebuilding their communities, rebuilding the cohesion and their identity, reconnecting with their ancestral lands and territories, and also strengthening their local governance systems. And this holistic process has become known as community ecological governance. And this approach originated with communities in the Colombian Amazon in the 1990s, with local partner Gaia Amazonas and Gaia Foundation, accompanied the communities who wanted to turn to their elders, find their knowledgeable elders, to revive the traditional knowledge and practices of the territory, of how to relate and abide by the laws of the territory. And in working with the elders, they also realized that the protection of sacred natural sites, the networks within the territories, was vital to the protection of ecosystems and the communities. The process has involved community dialogues, intergenerational learning between the elders and the youth, and also exchanges between the communities. And once the communities have revived some of their knowledge, they felt ready to document some of the knowledge through the form of ecocultural maps and calendars. And I have a picture here just to give a flavour of communities coming together to map the ecosystems in their territory, the way they relate, their culture, their stories of origin, all come through. And the ecocultural maps also indicate how their human activities, their farming, their education systems, are all aligned with what's going on in the wider ecosystem and also the universe. What became clear was that this process is and should be by the communities. It's community-led. It has to be on their own terms. So the communities documented in their own language, at their own pace. They articulated it in their own self-expression. And they also screened the knowledge that they shared, because knowledge is sacred. And so they determined what knowledge they wished to share. It's primarily for the communities to pass on to future generations. But at a critical point, they may feel they want to share it with the wider public and governments as a way of asserting their rights and responsibilities to the land. In 2002, the Colombian communities felt ready to share their experiences and lessons with partners in Africa. And Gaia Foundation, the African Biodiversity Network, and Gaia Amazonas facilitated an intercultural exchange, and which led to the seeding of Community Ecological Governance, or CEG, to Africa, where they've been adapting it and evolving it. It's not a process that you can just copy from one community to the other. It has to be very much experienced and grounded in the reality of the local context. The communities found that the deeper the revival process, the stronger they became as a community, so that in terms of rebuilding, the more resilient they became to external threats, and also the more confident they became in asserting their rights and responsibilities. As threats such as mining have increased, communities have felt the need to engage with the legal system, but they're doing it consciously, using law as a tool on their own terms. So, for example, in Colombia, the peoples of the Pira-Paraná region engaged at both the national and international level to recognize their traditional knowledge, their cosmologies, as intangible cultural heritage, and it's now been recognized by UNESCO. In South Africa, the communities have been applying for registration of their network of sacred natural sites as a heritage site, but asserting that the sacred natural sites are no-go areas for development and mining. So again, it's been done on their own terms. In Uganda, it's really exciting to see the emergence of communities advocating specifically for the rights of a lake to defend it from mining. And in other countries like Benin, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Ghana, there are also other precedents with legal recognition of customary laws based on the laws of nature. All these precedents are contributing to a body of law that now recognises the law of nature. And we've heard from Tom about examples in Europe, and from Cormac about other precedents, rights of nature precedents. So there's a real sense of a body of law and also movement around the rights of nature and laws of the earth. Coexisting with this CEG process has been the evolution of the term Earth Jurisprudence by Thomas Berry to realign our human laws with the laws of the earth. Since our meeting in 1999, Gaia Foundation has been supporting the practice and recognition of Earth jurisprudence, particularly through intercultural exchanges and helping to connect and nurture a regional intercultural movement. And it's really inspiring to see now a growing global movement of advocates and practitioners of Earth law. And we heard about the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, which is also helping to build the momentum. So it's clear that Earth jurisprudence is not a new term, it's affirming the indigenous practices, but it also calls on us all to live by the laws of nature in our own practice, personal practice. In terms of other movements that are emerging, there is now a movement of communities and organizations uniting in solidarity to protect life and resist the threats to life such as mining. It's providing a space for communities to have the confidence to say no and to also say yes to mutually enhancing livelihoods. And this Yes to Life, No to Mining movement is also you can join, you can pledge in solidarity, and I'm happy to share more information later. So it's clear that Earth jurisprudence requires both personal and collective practice. We all have a responsibility as a current generation to live by the laws of nature and to protect life for future generations. I'd like to leave you with the words of Thomas Berry to the future generations. To the children, to all the children, to the children who swim beneath the waves of the sea, to those who live in the soils of the earth, to the children of the flowers in the meadows and the trees in the forest, to all those children who roam the land and the winged ones who fly with the winds, to the human children too, that all the children may go together in the future in the full diversity of the regional communities. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Karine. We have room for a few questions right now, if there are any pressing questions. And maybe Tom and Karine could come back, and we're going to bring Cormac up on the screen so he can respond as well. Now there's a mic going around, so if you have a question, please wait for the mic to come to you, and then Cormac will be able to hear you as well. So there was one here in the third row. Doesn't sound like it's on. Still.
That's better. Oh, crikey. Really is better. Where to begin? So many questions are obviously going to be coming out of this. My name's Adrian Shaw. I'm actually one of the people that actually worked on the original tar sands project, which underlies fracking. I'm a radical scientist and artist. I now live in Nottingham and involved with a number of issues here, most notably recycling in art and play as a member of Playworks. What I'm very keen on doing as a radical scientist here is actually bringing a scientific perspective to backup. In other words, the way of from the radical science movement of scientists, local scientists in their communities acting more and more in terms of support to back up the legal initiatives being carried out. We heard quite clearly about today. And I'm very interested in that. I'm interested in collecting here from this conference a register of people that might be willing to do that. There is obviously hope. I'm disturbed about one thing, though. Let me just deal with it this way. It's all out of order. But Cormac's statement that native peoples had to be introduced to the idea of rights from a perspective, presumably that perspective would be an Eurocentric one. I mean, where's this rights thing coming from? That does raise ethical arguments.
Great. Maybe we could go to Cormac.
Sorry,
Cormac
It's just, I don't know if you heard that question.
And let him respond to that. Cormac, did you get that question?
Yes, I did. Perhaps I was slightly misunderstood.
Maybe.
The word for rights does not exist in many of these cultures. Mm-hmm. Rights, of course, is a concept which certain cultures have made up. And it enables the machinery of the state, the courts, the police, etc., to be used to enforce certain aspects of relationships. Now, other cultures use other mechanisms to achieve this. So it's not so much that the idea that other beings are entitled to be respected that is foreign to indigenous cultures. It is simply the word. They would see it as obvious and self-evident that one must respect the other beings in the community. So I don't think that it's a imposition of a culturally foreign concept so much, although there is some aspect of that. It's translating an indigenous worldview where all beings are subjects with dignity, inherent volition, and the right to be respected as such, into the equivalent means of recognizing that which would apply in a Western legal system.
Okay. We have another question here. Are there any other questions for right now? Okay, there's quite a lot. Maybe we'll take three. Sorry, we have so little time. I'm going to take three questions and then allow the speakers to respond to them. So go ahead.
Thank you very much. Do individual organisms, as part of nature, however that might be defined more collectively, do individual organisms, as part of nature, however nature might be defined more collectively, have rights relative to each other? For instance, does a lion have a right to eat an antelope? Conversely, does an antelope have a right not to be eaten by a lion for human beings to protect the antelope from the lion? Also, do the individual organisms, as part of nature more widely, have rights individually relative to human beings? For instance, does a plague, bacteria or virus, have a right to eat human beings? Does a lion have a right to eat a human being? Thank you.
Thank you. And then there's a question on the top edge. And yeah.
In Christopher Stone's book, the dissenting opinion is quite clear that where nature has a human advocate, there's no reason not to consider rights. And I'm just curious, within the existing Earth law efforts, I was at a conference in Australia recently, and they all of the arguments seem to emerge from within indigenous cultures, within political contexts where they're strong. So I guess the question I have for the panel, is there any indication that the emerging philosophical, ethical discourse in, the primary centers of the Western world, is there any sense of a evolving argument for nature that goes beyond the indigenous support network?
Okay, thank you. And then one more in the center here.
Hello. This question actually kind of follows on from what was just said. I was interested to hear you, Cormac, mention that the Rights of Nature Tribunals work with the Universal Declarations of both human rights and the rights of Mother Earth. So it's about the relationship between the two. The idea of dignity, the idea of rights coming from Earth, and comparing that to the idea of buen vivir, which is where the rights of nature are coming to. So I guess my question is there room to be more overt about the sort of the foundation for these two different kinds of rights and how they fit together, and would that be helpful?
Okay, great. Who would like to begin?
Perhaps I could begin?
Sure, go ahead.
They're all excellent questions. The use of the term rights is primarily serves to create corresponding duties on human beings. So it also serves to emphasize the fact that nature or aspects of nature that bears those rights are subjects. They have their own autonomy. They are self-regulating beings, if you like. So it serves a conceptual purpose, but at a practical level, the key issue, if you go to court, is what are the corresponding human duties to respect those rights. So the relationship between the lions and the zebras is not the problem. Lions and zebras know how to deal with each other, and sometimes the zebra gets away and sometimes the zebra gets eaten. The reason why a lion eating a zebra would not be a violation of the rights of nature is because when there are conflicts between the rights of two species, they must be resolved in a way which is consistent with the health and well-being and integrity of the whole. Now, ecosystems are held together by food chains. It is extremely important for the health of the planet that things eat each other. It's vital. So that's not a problem, and the rights of nature doesn't seek to regulate the relationship between two non-human actors. It is simply concerned with the evolution of the human systems of governance, so that human beings recognize that they have duties not only to other human beings, but also to the earth as a whole and specific aspects of that. The question that you raise in connection with the plague is a more difficult one, in the sense that certainly any species must have the right of self-defense, but there is a definite conflict between the right of the plague versus the right of humanity. And in nature, it normally plays itself out in the sense that some people get infected and die or become ill and others don't. Quite frankly, I would prefer that plagues like Ebola are contained in ways which prevent them from killing human beings. But it may be that there is an argument which says that it would be unlawful from a Earth rights perspective to completely eradicate Ebola. But certainly these are the kind of difficult issues which would have to be argued out, if I can put it that way. The point is to establish a balance in a way which is beneficial to the whole. And frequently we find that aspects of nature which we once regarded as entirely negative and unhelpful and worthy of eradication prove to be important to us at a later stage. So I think eradicating anything is unwise, but certainly I think that we have the right to protect ourselves against different viruses, etc., that may attack us. But I think the important thing to recognize is that although we claim to have inherent human rights, and this is where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, if you like, a subset of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, in the sense that it's a species-specific articulation of rights, but it is problematic if only one species has rights without the rights of those species being balanced against the rights of other species. Hence the need to contextualize the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. But the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth specifically recognizes in the text that it is not intended to be a comprehensive articulation of all rights. But the practical reality of this is simply that you don't find rights in nature, even though we claim to have inherent human rights. What you find in nature is relationships. And different societies take decisions about which of those relationships they are going to use the legal system to enforce. So in South Africa, it is recognized that there's a reciprocal duty of support between a parent and a child. A child must be supported by its parents when it's young, and when the parents are old and aged and cannot support themselves, the child must support the parent. Now, that is simply one aspect of the parent-child relationship which the community has chosen to recognize by allocating rights, because it's seen as beneficial to the community as a whole. What we're talking about here is expanding the scope of our legal system, as has been done in almost all the great democratic struggles of the past, whether it's the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the anti-apartheid movement, the civil rights movement. They've all been concerned with expanding the class of rights holders to ensure greater equality and harmony within society. And this is, in my view, the 21st century equivalent of that. So just to end off, on the point about indigenous rights, I am not an indigenous person in the accepted definition of the term, and certainly there are many other people like me who've come to these ideas other than through indigenous cultures, although my writing was definitely influenced by what I'd read and about indigenous legal systems and my interpretations of them. But if one looks at the vast sweep of human history, one realizes that the current legal systems are the aberrant ones. For the vast majority of human history, we have recognized that we are wholly dependent on Earth, that all we need is derived from the Earth, and accordingly, it is very important to our survival and well-being to maintain relationships of respect and particularly reciprocity. For every taking, there must be a giving with the rest of the planet. The idea that the planet is a machine that we can dominate and use to our own ends, and that should be incorporated in legal systems which define nature as property in the same way as we define people as slaves, that is a relatively recent concept. I mean, it's centuries old, but in the greater scheme of things, it's an aberration from the whole. So, if you like, this is a way of helping current civilizations to adapt to the scientific reality that our future is wholly dependent on the future of the planet, and we can only secure it by establishing mechanisms for regulating human behavior that ensure that we maintain mutually respectful and mutually beneficial relations with the other beings in the community.
Tom and Corinne, maybe you have a response as well?
Just, oh gosh, that's loud. Just a couple of points on the indigenous question. The Falkirk Community Charter, which I mentioned, was not actually a rights of nature document at all. The people that were involved in assisting the community with the process were very much aware that they wanted that to be the document to be of the community, and the community weren't aware of rights of nature arguments. What was interesting is that the idea of that sort of respect for ecosystems and rights of nature is there in the document, so it emerged in any event. And on the question of the room for being more overt between human rights and the rights of nature, then yes. I mean, I think from the point of view of part of the problems in the UK is we don't have a constitution of rights as such, and there's all sorts of debates over that. But the concept of the right to a healthy environment would obviously, when you think about it, could involve recognising the rights of other species to be part of that healthy environment. So I think it's the point of view of sort of rebalancing our system, the system that we have, to ensure it's a more realistic approach to governing our relationship with all of those around us.
I just very much agree with what Cormac was explaining, how wild law is about regulating our relationships in relation to nature rather than within nature. It's not for us as humans to dictate what takes place within nature, recognizing that we are part of nature. But also would like to just emphasize the importance of, while rights helps with the reframing of our relationship with nature, the emphasis really should be on our responsibilities, and we shouldn't shy away from that. We, as Cormac was saying, that with the urgency of the current ecological and social crises and cultural crises, we must act, and the rights of nature movement is helping to reframe the way we think and the way we act. But ultimately, as the communities explained in the film, it's very much about our personal practice, our way of life, that everything we do, whether it's the clothes we wear, the food we buy, the food we eat, is aligned with and complies with the laws of the earth. And I think that transcends whatever culture we come from. It's the reality that we are part of nature. So whether we refer to rights in the legal sense, or what Thomas Berry was referring to, and what many indigenous peoples inherently believe, that all species of nature have the inherent right from being created as humans have been created, to the right to exist in habitat and fulfill our role in the evolution of life.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm really sorry to draw this part of the conference to a close, but we really need to move on. So I'd like to thank Corinne Nadal, Tom Brennan, and Cormac Cullinan for their generous contributions to the conference. Thank you all. And hopefully we can continue this conversation in other forums. But for now, we're going to move on to the next part of the conference with the next panel. So thanks, Cormac. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So we're going to move immediately on now to the next panel, which will bring 3 of the participating artists and collectives to the table to give presentations, and we'll have a conversation as well before taking a break for lunch. So I'm only going to give very brief introductions because the biographies and descriptions of the artist projects are in the show and also in the the exhibition materials. So why don't we start with the presentation of Subhankar Banerjee, and that will be followed with Ursula Biemann and then the Otolith group, and we'll have then a discussion with all three participants. So Subhankar. Do you have images?
I do, yeah.
Is it already loaded?
It's already loaded.
Okay.
If somebody could help.
Okay.
Is Emma
Can we have some help with the loading of the images?
loading of the images, please? Oh, there you are. Okay. Yeah. Oh, thanks. I feel really deeply grateful and humbled to be part of this family and the conversations we are having here right now. Thanks to TJ, Alex, Irene, and all the staff members of the museum for making this reality, the conference and the exhibition. For the past 15 years, I have been deeply engaged with issues in the Arctic. And as many of you know, that the Arctic is warming at a rate of average 2 to 3 times more than the global average. And in the winter time, it's even more than that. And clearly a disintegrated Arctic would not only be a threat to the ecology and the human communities of the region, but a threat to the whole planet Earth. But there is a paradox there, and the paradox is this: the very climate change that is melting the Arctic is at the same time opening up the region to further resource extraction. And all of the Arctic nation states are going gung-ho about extracting these natural resources and turning the whole region into a potential future industrial wasteland. But I won't really go into in my presentation about that. In fact, what I'm going to do is not talk about climate change at all, but specifically address the topic of this conference, which is rights of nature. And some of the conversation we were having just right before this will very nicely and easily go into some of the things. Hopefully, I'll be able to respond to some of the questions that got brought up earlier this morning. And in fact, what I'll do is, before I go into the rights of nature discourse, I just want to say one quick thing, that my entire aesthetic oeuvre could be expressed in really one single word, and that word is non-human, with a parenthesis around it. So what I've been studying is, both as an artist as well as a writer, is that relationship that exists within the non-human communities and the relationship the human communities make with the non-human communities. That image is responding to a very tragic history in a tragic episode in Siberia's history, but I can tell you that later on. So moving on to the idea of rights of nature. Earlier this morning, the questions came up about the origin of some of this. And the rights of nature that we have been discussing since this morning and in this exhibition is what I would call the second major invocation of that phrase. This is not the first time. And in fact, my work actually exists in that minefield of the conflict that exists between these two major invocations. The first invocation, that's why the title of my talk was Rights of Nature Says Who. The first invocation was articulated in a book called The Rights of Nature, a history of environmental ethics by distinguished environmental historian Roderick Nash. And it's a really seminal book. Nash lays out centuries of intellectual evolution in religious studies, in philosophy, in science, going all the way back to the Romans. And the Romans did have the concept of rights of nature, jus animalium. Nash points out that a significant part of the foundational work that went into what eventually was called rights of nature was actually done right here in Britain during the 18th and 19th century. Henry Short was a key figure who wrote a book a very important book, Animals' Rights Considered in Relation to Social Progress, first published in 1891 and still in print today. And he was also the first biographer of Henry David Thoreau and the first person who popularized Thoreau's work. So it makes perfect sense to have this Rights of Nature exhibition and the conference right here in the UK, right here in a UK institution. But what does Rights of Nature mean? Nash tells us, based on his reading of the history of environmental ethics, that, quote, this is Nash's words, nature has intrinsic value and consequently possesses at least the right to exist. This position, sometimes called biocentrism, ecological egalitarianism, or deep ecology, and it accords nature ethical status at least equal to that of the humans, unquote. In fact, many of the names that were brought up earlier in the morning, Thomas Berry, Professor Christopher Stone, Aldo Leopold, all of their work has gone into this conception of rights of nature. Moving on, so that book came out in 1989. That very same year that Nash's book was published, eminent Indian sociologist and historian Ramachandra Guha wrote a combative essay, Radical American Environmentalism and Wilderness Preservation, a third world critique, first published in the journal Environmental Ethics and later widely anthologized. I should actually say at this point that I live, although I come from India, I live and work in the United States. So some of the things that I'm sharing with you is from the history of the United States environmentalism, just to kind of clarify that. Guha writes, the quote, social consequences of putting deep ecology, which is basically these rights of nature, into practice on a worldwide basis, what its practitioners are aiming for are very grave indeed, Guha feared. Guha further points out two key issues that the deep ecologists have remained silent about and what he thought are the key drivers of ecological destruction, overconsumption and growing militarization. By, quote, invoking the boogie of anthropocentrism is at best irrelevant and at worst a dangerous obfuscation, Guha charged. A few years later, he introduced environmentalism of the poor, a radical notion at the time, at a conference in Ecuador. He presented it in part as a protest against what he had perceived to be an arrogant and false belief held by many American environmentalists that poor people couldn't afford to be environmental. The, quote, consequences that the societies of the third world are too poor to be green shall not go undisputed, unquote, Guha wrote. So the rights of nature, that ethic, and the environmentalism of the poor, which I call a practice, have remained adversaries ever since. As you can see, the rights of nature that is being invoked here in Nottingham cannot be exactly same as the one that Nash had discussed, which really evolved over several centuries of deep thinking. Because at this exhibition and the conference, survival concerns of the indigenous people and their land use practices make a strong presence that was absent from the first invocation of the phrase. It was by design, though, as any invocation of habitability and sustainable land use practices by indigenous cultures on wilderness-worthy land would have forced of some form of anthropocentrism or nature providing for humans, which was not possible as it was already thrown under the bus by the practitioners of American deep ecology. Both instances of rights of nature are very important, however. The question I've been asking is this: can these two diametrically opposed poles of environmentalism, the rights of nature ethic, environment of the market, the question is, can these two coexist? And the answer is yes. And we can get there at least by one way that I have been calling long environmentalism, which simply means an environmental engagement that has lasted for a while. And I have been sort of saying say 25 years, which is intergenerational. I'm currently writing an essay on long environmentalism for a Routledge forthcoming anthology. For varieties of reasons, this photograph after the listening session which I made in 2006 was likely beyond the radar screen of most American environmental scholars in 1989 when Nash's Rights of Nature was published. The picture shows, by the way, as any photography historian will tell you, photographs don't tell the truth. This picture is not telling you the truth. These are not a bunch of happy people, but totally a group of pissed off individuals. But that's another story I'll tell you. They're all my friends, by the way. The picture shows Inupiat and Gwich'in cultural activists from Arctic Alaska, as well as environmentalists and scientists. It is a window into long environmentalism, and there are two braids in it. One involves the Inupiat and the other the Gwich'in, two indigenous communities of Arctic Alaska. I'll primarily discuss the latter braid, which constitutes the bulk of the photograph that you see in the exhibition here. Let me begin with a concrete example, Gwich'in caribou hunt. One of the intellectual reactions that may result from this particular image is that the photographer has fallen into the familiar trope of the ecological Indian. But the picture shows snowmobiles, gun, petrol cans, and even the clothing are a combination of traditional and modern. So this cannot be about ecological Indian, as that phrase has come to mean. In his historic 1988 testimony before the United States Congress, Gwich'in elder and cultural activist Jonathan Solomon said, quote, "Make no mistake, this is our life at stake here, the life of a modern hunting culture that is alive and healthy and growing," unquote. The emphasis is on modern hunting. The suite of caribou butchering photographs that you will see here in the exhibition is addressing the problem and is an attempt to decolonize American environmentalism. The public reactions about these images have been equally unsupportive. In 2005, the United Nations Environment Program gave me the Greenleaf Artist Award. But in 2009, when these images were shown in an exhibition in Copenhagen during the 2009 UN Climate Conference COP15, a UNEP representative from Nairobi, who is from Canada, no disrespect to Canadians, by the way, Joe and Jenna, no disrespect to Canadian, told me, quote, I'm paraphrasing her, "I wish you had not shown these photos here in Copenhagen. The post-domestic culture has gotten used to purchasing meat neatly packaged in plastic that seeing blood in meat has become disturbing for many." The suite of caribou butchering photographs is also addressing a philosophical problem and is an attempt to recognize where our food comes from. T.J. Demos had specifically asked me to address geosymptoms. If I understand the phrase correctly, then a geosymptom can at times address the presence of something and at other times about the absence and at times both. Geosymptoms frequently appear in my work through tracks and traces, as you will see the image in the exhibition, caribou tracks on coal seams. But I'll speak about this particular image. Shinjek River 2 is not about a beautiful or simply about a beautiful snow-covered Arctic river valley. When you go look at that photograph, notice here, you will see a track going from the lower left to from southwest to northeast, roughly about a 45-degree angle. Ecology is making a mark on geology and challenging the pro-development rhetoric from various US lawmakers that the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is a, quote, frozen wasteland of snow and ice, unquote, quote, barren wasteland, unquote, and the most egregious one, quote, a flat white nothingness, unquote. But Shinjek River 2 is also about absence. In 1956, renowned mammalogist Dr. Olaus Murie, with his wife, renowned conservationist Margaret Murie, led the now famous Murie expedition into the Shinjek River Valley. They were pretty much sitting on the same place that you saw the previous photograph. Where was I? Okay. And it was in that region, the hard work of the Muries and their colleagues led to the establishment of the Arctic National Wildlife Range in 1960, which was later expanded and renamed Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in 1980. On 6 December 1960, the United States Secretary of Interior, Fred Seaton, signed a public land order establishing the Arctic National Wildlife Range for, quote, the purpose of preserving unique wildlife, wilderness, and recreational values, unquote. Nowhere in this public land order do we find names of Gwich'in and Inupiat communities who have inhabited this region for many millennia and call the refuge home. Internationally known Gwich'in cultural activist Sarah James, who had accompanied me to Copenhagen for the COP15 summit, once showed me a hand-drawn map of the Shinjek River Valley with various Gwich'in family camps marked, and lamented the fact that that particular history of Gwich'in habitation along the Shinjek was wiped clean when the Arctic National Wildlife Range was established. She also made a rather explosive statement, quote, I learned by living out in the wilderness, unquote, which I interpreted to mean that it complicates the wilderness philosophy in America by injecting justice into it, as the American wilderness does not allow human habitation or sustainable harvest of biotic resources from the land for survival. Shinjek River too is both presence of biotic life and absence of cultural habitation in a particular geography. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northeastern Alaska is an international ecological treasure and is considered to be one of the most biodiverse conservation areas in the circumpolar north. Think of the Yasuni National Park. This is the Yasuni of the entire Arctic. In early June, the famed Porcupine River caribou herd calved on its coastal plain. The refuge has also nutritionally and spiritually sustained two indigenous communities for many millennia. The Gwich'in, who live on the south side of the Brooks Range mountain, and the Inupiat, who live along the Arctic coast of Alaska. But in the late 1960s, since oil was discovered in Arctic Alaska in the late 1960s, there have been proposals, many proposals, to open up the Arctic refuge to drilling for oil, all of which have been defeated so far, and the refuge continues to remain free of industrial development. The campaign to create and then protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from oil and gas development has been going on for 6 decades. It is one of the longest running environmental engagement on Earth. I have been a character in it for the last 15 years. The environmentalists and the Gwich'in continue to collaborate on protecting the refuge from industrial destruction, although their respective reasons for doing so is quite different. One leans toward rights of nature ethic, and the other toward environmentalism of the marginalized practice. Now imagine, can you imagine putting a petrol pump in the homeland of this caribou? Yes, BP, Shell, they can imagine such a horrendous thing. So have the curators of Rights of Nature exhibition. We finally come to, I love that sculpture, and I could not have imagined a better juxtaposition of my image with anything else, so this is absolutely perfect. We finally come to where rights of nature meets environmentalism of the marginalized. The juxtaposition here, in this space it is presented slightly differently, but I usually present like this. The juxtaposition raises at least 3 different kinds of aesthetic tensions. Scale, to see a large image we pull back, and to see a small image we go near. Content, we feel attraction toward the migrating caribou and repulsion toward butchering. History, we feel compelled to preserve a pristine wilderness untouched by man, where caribou have walked since time immemorial, but man has lived in that wilderness also since time immemorial and have depended on the caribou for survival. I'll say a few words about earth law as it relates to my practice. You may already know that there are several what could be called earth laws or nature laws in existence in the United States, including the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. If nature is given rights in a juridical sense, then how would it exercise those rights? Philosophers have given us at least one answer: by using a guardian or trustee framework where humans become the trustees. Of course, this has been debated very heavily in the philosophical community. Nevertheless, earth law comes in the second braid of my photograph, this after the listening session, and it's about shales drilling in the Arctic Ocean of Alaska, the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas, considered to be perhaps the most dangerous form of drilling anywhere on Earth, because no one knows how to clean up oil from underneath the frozen ice of the broken ice of the Arctic Ocean in the most harshest environment on this planet. I addressed that campaign primarily through where was I? Chukchi Sea, Arctic Alaska, that the traditional members of the Inupiat communities and the environmentalists have been fighting to stop, curb, or slow down. I addressed that campaign primarily through writing and less through images, although the two braids are connected as well, and takes me back to the early days of my Arctic photography. This is also about non-human, as the bear is approaching a whalebone left behind from the previous year's hunt by the Inupiat people. On March 19th, nearly 2 years later after this image was taken, on March 19, 2001, Senator Barbara Boxer displays a poster-sized version of the polar bear on Bernard Herbert photograph on the United States Senate floor to make a case against, by the way, that photo was along the Beaufort Sea coast, exactly where Shell wants to drill for oil. So Senator Barbara Boxer used that image on the US Senate floor to make a case against oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Her passionate plea helped secure a win for the conservationists that day, barely though, 52 to 48 vote, much to the dismay of the Bush administration. Senator Boxer's showing of my photograph, however, led to the censorship of my exhibition at the Smithsonian Institution, which later became the subject of a Senate hearing and finally a Senate investigation. I was also called effectively a liar by a very influential US Senator on the US Senate floor. The bear photograph, though, to use a contemporary slang, went viral and has since become one of the most published photographs in the history of the medium of photography, thanks to the Associated Press, who has been circulating that image all over the world without my permission or any remuneration to me. But I have no complaints against that. America's Arctic seas were calm, politically speaking, when President George W. Bush took office in 2001. But all that changed quickly. First the Bush and then the Obama administration exhibited unwise rush to exploit the Arctic seas for oil and gas. In doing so, the US government disregarded several nature laws, including the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and outright violated the National Environmental Policy Act. The only way we are winning so far on several cases that we have defeated the government and Shell is by invoking earth laws or nature laws on the ground, and we again won last year, on the ground that the US government has violated the National Environment Policy Act. I just wrote a kind of a detailed history of that. It's coming out in a US newspaper's Sunday magazine very soon. I want to wrap this, okay, I just want to, do I have maybe a couple more minutes or no? I should wrap up. Can I just say a couple more things? 2 minutes, okay, great. Let me just quickly go into, okay, I should have shown that. Just a little bit more on the geosymptoms. In the known and unknown tracks, geosymptoms and earth law came together to justify rights of nature. When I shared this photograph with environmental groups, it instantly raised a controversy. To the Inupiat and the environmentalists, the faint caribou tracks, which you don't see clearly, were well known. But what about those bold linear tracks? With some research, it was discovered that they are the imprints left behind by heavy 3D seismic exploration vehicle, but no oil company should have had permits to explore this protected northeast section of the Tashapak Lake Special Area with such vehicles. The photograph was used in the Save Tashapak Lake campaign to oppose oil and gas development in this wetland, which is, by the way, the largest wetland complex in the entire Arctic. When the Bush administration granted permission to open up the area for oil and gas development, the conservation community, in partnership with the Inupiat, filed a lawsuit against the US Department of Interior. In September 2006, the US District Court of Alaska ruled in favor of the plaintiffs on the grounds that the government had not done appropriate ecological studies and did not make a persuasive case that development would ensure safety for the sensitive ecology and the way of life of the Inupiat, who depend on the wetland. While the bold tracks may give the impression that it would come to dominate that particular geography, but in the end, in this instant, it was the faint tracks that prevailed. In caribou tracks on coal seams that you see in the exhibition, ecology makes a different claim on geology than the usual commercial exploitation. The Western Arctic caribou herd, the largest caribou herd in Alaska with nearly 380,000 animals, on which 40 different communities from 3 different tribes depend on, made these deeply etched tracks on the coal seams during their annual migrations, likely over many centuries or even millennia. As the image shows, the coal is right on the surface, and any development there will likely employ the ecologically devastating practice known as mountaintop removal. There is an estimated 4 trillion tons of bituminous coal in this place, which translates to about 4,000 years of coal burning at the current rate of US national consumption. I'm just wrapping it up, yeah. While coal is difficult and heavy to transport, there have been past and present proposals to develop this area for coal. And as the Arctic sea ice continues to melt, the transportation of resources and goods to the top of the earth becomes a reality. It is conceivable that there will be much pressure to develop all that Arctic coal. I want to just wrap this up by saying that a lot of work on art and environmental humanities need to get done before the two conceptions of rights of nature can be reconciled and build what we may call an egalitarian ecocentrism that accommodates concerns of the global north and the south. This exhibition and all the public programs, including this conference, I'm certain will contribute significantly towards such an effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Subhankar. Ursula Biemann is next up. So please welcome Ursula Biemann, who's going to speak about forest law, I think. So, Ursula. Do you have images?
That's not the first one. Where's the first one? No, it's missing. This is double, whereas this one. Is this keynote or is this PowerPoint? Yeah. Oh well. Hi, and thanks very much for this awesome invitation. Usually I'm kind of the odd one out when I speak about this new project, but here it's really embedded in such a strong discourse. I'm going to speak about forest law, which is the project that is also up in the exhibition. And as we've seen, rights of nature in the case of Ecuador is not wishful thinking, it's a legal reality. And it's this new constitution that was signed in 2008 was the result of various indigenous uprisings in the 80s and 90s, which led to a new government with much stronger indigenous political and juridical representatives who had then inscribed their ways of thinking and living in their constitution. And what's new and extraordinary is that it includes ecosystems, living forests, mountains, rivers, and so on, as legal subjects with, bearing rights. And the first article of these 5 laws that were created in this new constitution says, nature has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regenerations of its vital cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. So it's a very wide, very broad concept that it starts with. In the events, and I think that is what's really important here, is that if these rights are violated in any form, these newly declared juridical subjects may be defended in court by a person or a group. So for native communities who entirely depend on the forest for their livelihood, these laws, if they're enforced, can really guarantee their own survival. What is interesting is that with these new laws, Ecuador extends its jurisdiction to a multi-species population. And by doing so, it unhinges a human-centric legal conception and places them in a wider cosmopolitical context. As Cormac said, subjectivity is not in us, in humanity. It is a function that can be assumed and can be found anywhere. So indigenous nations in the Amazon speak of the living forest, selva viviente, which is a concept that not only concerns the life and reproductions of scientifically known species, but also living forest ecosystems, including vital but imperceptible beings like the master of the forests, of the rivers, the Amasanga, the Sacharuna, the Yashingu, who are vital and imperceptible, and they are the protectors of the forest and who keep the ecosystems alive. So this way of living and thinking with the forest comes under great pressure now from extractivist desires for oil and minerals, because there are these giant drilling and mining operations that are heavily weighing down on this extraordinarily biodiverse region. So since most of these territories are owned by indigenous nations, these are bound to create a lot of conflict and resistance. Forest law is a collaborative project with Brazilian architect Paulo Tavares, whose long-term research in the Ecuadorian Amazon, in the Amazon at large, is really the basis for this common field study that we did together in the Amazon, in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and the project comprises of a series of photo text panels of newly designed maps, a synchronized 2-channel video installation, and an artist book. So we feel that the complexity of the situation cannot be represented from a single hegemonic perspective. And we hope that through these multi-perspective vectors, the project engages with the deep embroilment of past and present geopolitics, with the living forest, and with the aesthetic and narrative means through which the constant advancement into the Amazon has been impelled. The process of extracting resources from the ground and transferring them to the global market, making them exchangeable, also extracts them from social and natural histories of where they come from, and of which they are part, like labor, migration, consumed environments, etc. The extraction from local ecologies is closely linked to the problem of how we tell stories of commodities and where they come from. Forest law concentrates on 3 landmark legal cases where the forest is brought to court. The project takes a slow road in trying to understand the ecological and cosmopolitical dimension of these paradigmatic trials on behalf of the forest and its people. One such case has been brewing in Shuar territories. This is actually so not well sequenced, these stills. The new case that is brewing now in the Shuar territories is in the south of Ecuador, where there is a huge Chinese copper mining project that is just about to break, just opened the territory for this. And it's enclosing on indigenous lands. Another unresolved case resonates through the film like as a haunting memory of this large-scale contamination of soils and water caused by Texaco in the 70s. We're not expanding on that case in the film, but it comes up in the form of a mute forensic performance unearthing this smelly nightmare. At the heart of the project, however, lies the case of Sarayaku. It's a Quechua people who owns a large territory of forest that can be entered only through the river or by arriving on a small propeller plane. They sued the state. Here's the leader of the Sarayaku people whom we interviewed. They sued the state of Ecuador at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights for intruding into their space and open it for oil exploration. A foreign company came and laid out the seismic lines across the land to form a deadly grid of buried explosives in the rainforest. Here you see the map of Samane, Moafi, and Paulo Tavares showing these overlapping jurisdictions. Showing the white line is the Sarayaku territory, and the yellow outline is the oil block that is designed. So it overlaps about to 2/3 of the oil block is on Sarayaku territory. What was particularly appalling to the Sarayaku people is that they targeted a forest area that is meant for the reproduction of animal species. They have organized the forest into hunting zones, fishing zones, and reserves, which they consider the living forest, where they hardly ever go themselves. The map doesn't simply operate as representation. Satellite technology is no longer used only as a top-down power instrument by states and corporations. NGOs and indigenous groups are increasingly using these mapping technologies as evidentiary material. So the Earth bears signs that can be interpreted and used in court. Forest Law the project joins these efforts. Paulo could speak really at length about this because he was part of the forensic architecture research project, and I'm sorry he cannot be here today. So Sarayaku elders spoke up during the public hearings at the Inter-American Court and claimed that if the forest disappears, they too will vanish, because the destruction of the jungle erases the soul. What makes this case so important is that it involves at the intersection of human rights and the rights of nature as two profoundly entangled realms. After a decade of struggle, Sarayaku won the case. The judges condemned the Ecuadorian state for violating the rights of communal property. This verdict confirmed that when traditional lands are involved, the rights to property has become the court's standing ruling on indigenous rights. Legal scholars consider this a problem because domestic and international law grants states a lot of leeway to interfere with property. Instead, they propose to situate the case more firmly in the regimes of international human rights. For now, there seem to be no other option, since the Inter-American Court doesn't take rights of nature into consideration. Forest law pursues a third route. Placed in the context of the anthropogenic Amazon and planetary climate change, the project sees the groundbreaking legal cases unfolding in the Amazon as an opportunity to consider an important legal potential that lies beyond both property rights and human-centric laws. The video prologue evokes the Earth as a living planet whose surface has evolved into ecosystems that keep her metabolism alive. A 4-degree rise of temperature would be enough to disable the Amazon ecosystem and turn it into dry scrub. With this important cooling system shut down, the planet turns increasingly hot and dry, with ever-shrinking land left for human food production. When the forest is gone, world civilization will have come to an end. In other words, what unfolds in this remote corner of the rainforest is of worldly importance. What moves to the foreground of our intellectual attention are the most material concerns. Toxic waste that are spilled out after extraction and remain a jarring presence in the equatorial forest 30 years later come under a forensic scrutiny before forest law. Let me see, no, I don't have that one. No longer the passive backdrop to human history, the landscape, nature, and matter itself turns to the fore and becomes the subject of this aesthetic examination. The evidence brought to the surface speaks of the perishing of worlds, of life worlds, with whom the law has no relationship. Nature and hence life forms and their ecologies are treated by the world legal system as mere property to be traded, consumed, and at best protected by environmental laws imposing regulations on corporate and private actors. The recognition of natural communities bearing equal rights of existence is only just rising over the legal horizon. While we have parceled off the land into small cells that can be owned and exploited, entire living systems of the earth are illegally invisible. The two synchronized videos in their stereo optic expose a landscape that is populated by all kinds of sentient beings who inhabit different dimensions of reality, minute copper deposits, forest spirits, indigenous councils, scientists, medicinal plants, international law, global oil corporations, river systems. By addressing this complex ecology of practices, forest law delves into cosmopolitical considerations, the politics of humans and of everything else. The shift from worldly to cosmic politics raises the question of how do law, ecology, and cosmology conceive of the global, the cosmos, of something common to go by. If realism has made us see that reality is something that needs to be built rather than something already there, we can assume that the common world, too, needs to be made, not just represented. Forest law contributes to this endeavor by tying local ecologies to an entity that Ursula calls environmental world citizenship, where rights of nature are brought in contact with the kind of thinking that has emerged from years of developing a practice of global social connectedness. Thank you.
Next and last for this panel is the Otolith group. So I invite Kojo Eshun and Angelica Segar to give their presentation. Thank you.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Okay.
Can everybody hear me? Are these on?
Now they are, yeah.
Okay, now they're on. Thank you. Okay, so I hope some of you had a chance to see Medium Earth, the film we made last year, which is showing in the show Rights of Nature. And this text we prepared for this occasion is a kind of sequel to some aspects of Medium Earth. So we'd like to thank Alex and TJ for inviting us. We're very happy to be here in the company of Ursula, Subhankar, and so many scholars and artists whose work we admire and whose work we've learnt from. And without further ado, we're going to begin. Just to say briefly, what you see behind you is images from an archive, an informal archive that we gathered from the United States Geological Survey in Pasadena. It's an archive of unofficial earthquake predictions, which is what Medium Earth is about, and it's what we're going to develop in this short presentation. Okay. Anjali, do you want to say anything?
Yes, I mean, I think what we are interested in here is the concept of geo kind of symptomology. So, and we can perhaps talk about that a bit later when we sit as a panel.
Okay, so we'll begin. This is called Night Search for Four Voices. Okay. Welcome to Night Search. It's 7 p.m. on March 2nd, 2013. I'm Eddie Middleton, here in Memphis. Justin Abner is up in Pigeon Forks, Tennessee, and we're interviewing Charlotte King tonight. She's a famous biological sensitive who has been able to predict earthquakes quite accurately, and she has amazing abilities to pick up on frequencies that most people can't experience. Charlotte, I know you do a lot of other things that you're noted for, but I guess the main thing is the earthquake predictions. And so just to start out, I want to welcome you to Night Search and ask you maybe to fill in a little bit about your background, how you got started with this kind of earthquake prediction thing. So our listeners who maybe are not familiar with you know something about, your background.
Thank you, Eddie. So, in 1981, 1980, I should say, I connected with the mountain when here in California, when St. Helens started getting active. I started getting really bad headaches, which actually started back in about 1979. And I didn't know why, and they, did tests and stuff, and everything was fine medically. So I basically just had thousands, sorry, Eddie. So I basically just had headaches all the time, migraines, and nobody knew what it was. I was seeing specialists and given medication and stuff. Nothing would help. And when they first had the first earthquake on St. Helens in March the 16th of 1980, it felt like my head was going to blow up. And then when the volcano had its first earthquake, the pain subsided just briefly. And I said, it's the volcano. And from that point on, I was locked into Mount St. Helens, and I still am. I can feel it from anywhere, from where I am now, 90 miles away, to when I was in Colorado, over almost 2,000 miles away or more. So it's just, it's really just a connection with the earth. And what really put it all together for me was that in 1979 was the beaching of the whales here in Oregon. There were a series of sound changes that woke me up from a sound sleep. No pun intended, and I was really scared. I didn't know why. I started crying. I called the television station up in Portland that I was reporting information to, and they said nothing was happening. And then that evening, about 4 hours after the call, they interrupted the television station to talk about a series of sperm whales that were beaching on the Oregon coast. And in all, 41 beautiful giant mammals beached and died. And when the sound changed, they beached. And then 4 days later, was it 3 to 4 days later, there were 4 moderate earthquakes in Big Bear, California. And it just all clicked for me at that point. I knew that I was feeling earthquakes, at least in the United States. I didn't know too much about other areas yet. And as time progressed, I not only had sound changes, but I also have physical symptoms. And each part of my body is tied to a different geographical location. And I'm not unique in this. The only unique thing was that I was able to put it together, because there are hundreds and thousands and even maybe hundreds of thousands of people out there that feel these things. They just don't know what they're feeling. And some can hear things, and some can feel things, and some do both, and very few do both. Most of the people that hear it in the higher frequency, whereas I hear it in the subsonic sound level, which most people do not, although there are a couple of people that do. And it doesn't matter if you're in Oregon, Tennessee, or in Wyoming, or in Japan, or China, or Chile. It doesn't make any difference. The sounds and the symptoms are always the same, and that way you can identify where the next event is going to take place.
So let me ask you, Charlotte, although of course the tsunami that hit Japan a couple of years ago and destroyed the Fukushima nuclear reactor, did you pick up on that?
That's right, Eddie. Oh, absolutely. There were about 3 days of precursor activity for that. Japan is always left shoulder blade pain. And if it's over a 6, which obviously this was, it's a sharp, jabby heart pain on the left side of the chest. It feels like a knife is just going in and out, sharp little jabbles. And that's quite uncomfortable, but not severe. And also, animals react to Japan if it's over a 6. Cats start vomiting. Mostly it's fur balls, but after a while, it's not even fur balls. And when you have one cat that throws up a fur ball, as you know, that's not a big deal. But when you have all of your cats doing it at the same time, then it's a big deal. I also have ants that I keep very close watch on. They're kind of my backup precursor group here. And before the quake in Japan, they were climbing the wall in droves, literally thousands of them, and up over the ceiling. They did not want to be in the ground at all. And the morning of the earthquake, I went to go to work, and I was still working at that time. When I opened the garage door, and the whole driveway, well, I will not say the whole driveway, I like to think the whole driveway was coated, but the whole driveway surface was littered with dozens of them, earthworms that had crawled out of the ground. And I said, uh-oh, and I went back to work, and I had to move a bunch of them before I could back my car out. And I went on to work, and then when I got to work and parked the car, I was still sitting there trying to assimilate what I'd seen, and I knew what was going to happen. And I went upstairs to the office, and there were 4 steps going up that are concrete. And when you have that landing to go into the door, well, the earthworms had climbed those 4 concrete stairs, and there were still some on the bottom steps. And they had made it all the way to the top landing, and they were laying all over the landing up there just to get away from the ground. And that's when I got my permission to go out in my car, get my laptop out, and send out an alert for Japan.
And that happened a day or 2 later, or what?
No, just a few hours.
Okay.
I had put the alert out. I had already been putting the alert out to my group for several days. But to pay, Japan was really doing something. But this was a heads up, kind of a warning shot that I send out, we're in a timeline now. Something's going to happen within the next 12 hours or less.
So I've got to ask you this. I know you've been doing earthquake predictions based on these kind of biological symptoms since what, 1980 or
1979.
And how accurate have you been, if you don't mind talking about your track record of success to date?
Oh, no, not at all. Obviously, I've not been 100%. Some of the great big ones that I felt were going to happen were maybe a day or 2 late. There's been 3 or 4 times that I've missed one, but then the precursors continued, and then it did show up. So it wasn't that it didn't happen. The precursors that I watched continued to happen, so it moved the timeline out accordingly. And my group knows how that works. But it's just each time you have an event, you move the timeline out another day or 2 beyond what the timeline was originally set on. And it's kind of hard to explain, but anyway, that's what I do. And I'm always ahead of time. You know, the timeline when it's going to be Mount St. Helens, I'm 100%, Japan, I'm 100%, Mexico, I'm 100%, Oregon, I'm 100%, Chile, I'm definitely 100%. And there's, you know, you can miss some.
Charlotte, can you tell us, is there anything right now going on that would, precursors that would indicate some major quake in some place in the world that you could tell us?
Well, we're expecting, Oregon's stirring up a little bit because the vision's getting really bad, and Oregon is always vision. And I'm not concerned, it's just probably an aftershock to the 5.1 we had a couple of days ago. And left lower ribs and back are hurting again. That's Oceania, probably New Zealand, Australia, in that area because they're due. They're also due for an aftershock that's the area that's been really uncomfortable later. And my right knee and hip and leg have been hurting. That's Peru, Brazil, Colombia.
Okay, handing over to Justin now.
Okay, Justin Abner here in Pigeon Forks, Tennessee. I just wanted to bring in our second guest who's been waiting patiently all this time over in the Pacific Palisades. Professor Theodore Adorno, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Great. Now I understand that you've been conducting up to the minute content analysis of the 3 months of the daily column, Astrological Forecasts by Carol Reiter in the Los Angeles Times from November 1952 to February 1953. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
As I understand that this is a brand new research that you have just completed, can you share some of your findings with us?
Our social system, in spite of its closeness and the ingenuity of its technical functioning, seems actually to move towards self-destruction. The sense of an underlying crisis has never disappeared since the First World War, and most people realize, at least dimly, that the continuity of the social process and somehow of their own capacity of reproducing their own life is no longer due to supposedly normal economic processes, but to factors such as universal rearmament, which by themselves breed destruction while they are apparently the only means of self-perpetuation. This sense of threat is real enough, and some of its expressions, such as the A and H bombs, are about to outrun the wildest neurotic fears and destructive fantasies. The more people profess official optimism, the more profoundly they are probably affected by this mood of doom. The idea, correct or erroneous, that the present state of affairs somehow must lead towards a total explosion, and that the individual can do very little about it. The sense of doom may today obtain a peculiar sinister coloring by the fact that the present form of social existence seems to go down, whereas no new and higher form of social organization appears on the horizon. The wave of the future seems to consummate the very fears that are produced by the conditions of the present. Astrology takes care of this mood by translating it into a pseudo-rational form, thus somehow localizing free-floating anxieties in some definite symbolism, but it also gives some vague and diffused comfort by making the senseless appear as though it had some hidden and grandiose sense, while at the same time corroborating that this sense can neither be sought in the realm of the human, nor can probably be grasped by humans. The combination of the realistic and the irrational in astrology may ultimately be accounted for by the fact it represents a threat and a remedy in one, just as certain psychotics may start a fire and at the same time prepare for its extinction.
So if I interpret you correctly, Professor, you seem to believe that the cult of God has been replaced by the cult of facts, just as the fatal entities of astrology, the stars, are themselves viewed as facts, things ruled by mechanical laws.
That is correct. One could not grasp the specificity of astrology and of the whole frame of mind it stands for if one would simply call it a reversion to older states of metaphysics. What it's characteristic of is the transfiguration of a world of things into quasi-metaphysical powers. Auguste Comte's postulate that positivism should become a kind of religion is fulfilled ironically. Science is hypostasized as an ultimate absolute truth.
I would like to throw that back to Charlotte King, who is in the studio with Eddie Middleton. While you've been looking at how people look at the stars, Charlotte's been listening into the earth. Charlotte, can you hear me? I can hear you just fine, Justin. Great. So my next question would be like, do you predict like any major events coming soon? Eddie may have asked a question that about that already in regards to solar flares or any... Well, it's hard to answer because I'm in a timeline. I've moved the timeline out several days for another bigger event again. I haven't seen the major precursor that I'm watching for yet. Once I see that, I'll put a heads up.
Okay.
It's kind of in a 3-day timeline right now, but I am watching for another, the final precursor to show up before I can actually put a heads up on it. Like I said before, I'm really feeling Peru, Brazil, Colombia. That's the right leg. If it gets into the left leg, then you have to watch out for Ecuador. Watching for Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, the Kermadec Islands. If it's New Zealand, it could be North or South Island or even Christchurch. Those are the main areas that I pick up on. I think Oregon is always vision. As you can see, fine, but everything is blurry. Your depth of perception is off. So if you're trying to read something, you can put it next to your face or 10 inches away, and you still can't read it. Even though you can read it, you can't. It's just blurred. And other people are picking up on Chile, so things are still moving around.
So, well, look, we could even talk about this, but I think you said some people had committed suicide before major quakes occurred.
Oh, Chile.
Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Sure. That's a term I've coined, the Chile connection. And Chile is very different. Chile affects the left eye, the left side of your face. It feels, well, I call it feeling disconnected because it isn't like it doesn't really belong to you. It's like everything's off a little bit. And you actually get neuralgia, often in your face itself, on the skin. It's sore. It hurts to blink your eye. And sometimes there's a headache with Chile. There's never usually chest pain with Chile, though what happened with Chile is an emotional thing. It's instantaneous, anger for no reason, road rage, domestic violence escalates, suicides escalate, shootings, murders, mass murders, even terrorist attacks. All of these things tend to precede Chile's earthquakes. And I don't really know exactly why, except that I know it's a particular frequency that affects the brain in some way. And it's Chile, Bolivia, Argentina. I always tell people when I send out my emails, pay attention to the railroad crossings, because for whatever reason, before earthquakes in Chile, people are always on the edge. That are going to commit suicide, that they feel like they're going to commit suicide. They choose it to do it by walking down railroad tracks, waiting for a train, walking towards a train on a railroad track, even lying down on the tracks, waiting for the train, or stepping in front of a train. We had over 35 fatalities here in Salem within about 3 years on the railroad tracks. Here, going through the town on a 5-mile stretch, and both Amtrak and Southern Pacific conductors and engineers were on those trains, and some of them more than once. And there was nothing that they could do because it takes 6 blocks to stop a train. And these people were seriously just lying there on the tracks, waiting for the train, or they would step in front of it, or in one instance, someone was walking down the train with another person, and they heard the whistle. They turned around, they looked at it, and they just kept on walking.
If you could just hold it there, Charlotte, we just have time to introduce our final guest on Night Search, Professor Bruno Latour, all the way over there in Edinburgh. He's taken time away from preparing for the 4th of his 6 Gifford lectures at Edinburgh University to be with us tonight. Professor Latour, are you there? Yes, I'm here. Great. I understand that you are about to deliver your 4th Gifford lecture on the Anthropocene and the destruction of the image of the globe today at 2 p.m. on 25th February 2013. That is correct, yes. You've been listening to Charlotte all this time, have you not? Yes, I have. Indeed, I have. And what I want to say very briefly is this. It is our globe, our ideal idea of the globe, that should be destroyed for any work of art, any aesthetic to emerge. If you agree to hear in the word aesthetic its old meaning of being able to perceive and to be concerned, that is a capacity to render oneself sensitive, a capacity that precedes any distinction between the instruments of science, of art, and of politics.
Justin here in Pigeon Forks, Tennessee, just following your words down there in Edinburgh, Professor. Charlotte, when you hear Bruno Latour talking about the capacity to render yourself sensitive, you are ahead of him in a sense. After all, you've been a sensitive since 1979, haven't you? Yes, I have. I'll get emails from people in Oregon or other places, and all of a sudden they say, Chile must be going on, because I have been angry all day at everything, or at my husband, or we are fighting. It must be Chile. And it is. It truly is. If you start getting angry and you don't know why, and there's no reason for it, you just have to look for an outside cause, and that's usually Chile. And suicides really, really escalate before Chile. In fact, I had 3 people that I know personally. 2 of them were good friends that knew all about Chile, and they both committed suicide before Chile earthquakes. And they had an Operation Lifesaver by our governor's task force here in Oregon. And they asked me to come in and speak to the group because I actually predicted 3 of the fatalities before they happened based on the Chile connection. And so they had come to me and to talk to me. And those fatalities, says Justin, happened on the railroad tracks. They preceded some of the quakes in Chile, every single one of them. Every fatality except one, where an 84-year-old lady fell on a track when she was crossing. They were followed by earthquakes in Chile, every single one of them. Amazing, Professor. Do you want to come back on that?
I have to go prepare for my 4th Gifford lecture now. I would just like to emphasize that the capacity to render oneself sensitive precedes any distinction between the instruments of science, of art, and of politics.
Thank you for joining us, Professor Latour. We appreciate it. Now, Charlotte, did these suicides just occur in Chile with Chile earthquakes, or is that just earthquakes in general? Chile, and I don't know what it is. I don't know what the mechanism is that causes it, but I know that it is there, and it is really easy to see. All you have to do is go back and look at events that have taken place, and then go back and look at the reports on the archives at the USGS. And you know, the United States Geological Survey. And you can see Chile followed every one of those events.
They had a 9-point quake in Chile not too long ago, or am I mistaken?
Well, Eddie, 9.2, that was the biggest quake. And anybody has ever recorded, it was a 9.2. That was quite a few years back, I think. I don't really remember the exact date, but yeah, they did. It was a really big quake. I think it was the biggest one. Though there was one in Alaska, 1964, I think that was a bigger one, I'm not sure. We had Chile, Bolivia, and we had Alaska, Japan, have all been 9 or greater. Chile, the Chile quake in 2010, that was 8.8, and I predicted that one. And that was the one I predicted to ABC television before it happened, and it hit 4 hours later.
Wow. Professor Adorno, you've been very patient over there in Pacific Palisades. Would you like to respond to anything Charlotte King has been saying? Yes, I would. The veiled tendency of society towards disaster lulls its victims in a false revelation with a hallucinated phenomenon. In vain they hope in its fragmented blatancy to look their total doom in the eye and withstand it. Panic breaks once again after millennia of enlightenment over humanity whose control of nature as control of men far exceeds in horror anything men ever had to fear from nature. Thank you, Professor. Lots to think about there. We appreciate you taking time away from your urgent work on your 10 theses on occultism to join us all on Night Search this evening. Charlotte, would you like to come back on anything Professor Adorno has said?
Chile, the Chile quake in now 2010, now that was 8.8, and I predicted that one. That was the one I predicted to ABC television before it happened, and it hit 4 hours later. And that one is on YouTube. They actually put it out there on YouTube. And my interview that they did with me, that was on the news for 4 hours after the quake, within 4 hours of the quake. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for maybe 3 questions or so. Ursula and Subhankar, do you want to join us on the panel? So I'd like to, again, pass around the mic for 3 questions right now. So are there any to begin with? There's one in the corner over here. The idea of the panel, I'll just say a couple words, was if rights of nature extend legal standing to non-human subjects, then how are non-human subjects expected to to speak on their behalf? How are they expected to articulate their interests in courts of law? So the very different presentations and speaking from very different artistic engagements, I think, speak to that question of speculating how non-human agents can possibly signify or produce forms of representation. So, yeah.
Thank you. What forms of energy production would the members of the panel, or indeed anyone who's spoken this morning or attending the conference, would like to see? For instance, would people rather have carbon-based energy production, or nuclear, fusion or fission, or renewables, so-called, including possibly carbon capture and storage, or biomass with its implication for land use? Secondly, but also in relation to this point, do people attending this conference want to see a cap or even reduction in population level? Thank you.
Okay. Are there? Thank you for that. Are there a couple more questions so that we could put several to the panel right now? Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, it's a question for Subhankar. I'd like to hear you expand a little bit on in what way the long generational approach to ecology can bring together these seemingly opposing notions of a kind of untrammeled nature and nature independent from human activity and a sort of a recognition of the ways in which people are intimately dependent on the interrelations of hunting and fishing and so on. I missed that understanding of the generational approach that you're suggesting.
Thank you. Any others for right now? Go ahead.
Is this? Oh, yeah, it's on. In what sort of? I mean, this is all an organic process, so maybe like we can't spell it out. But what are some possible ways you can envisage the local struggles taking place, for example, in the Americas, with a sort of a need for international or sort of global movement, but in a way that doesn't undermine national development of countries in the South. It's a bit of a tricky question. I don't know if I expressed it nicely or not. But yeah, basically, in what practical ways can local struggles unite with global movements that doesn't undermine national development in the South? I think that's a better way of putting it.
Okay, thank you.
And that's good for everyone.
Who would like to? Was there one more? Yeah, please. The mic is coming to you right now.
Just a very quick question, just a very immediate response really to Kojo and Anjali's performance. And I wondered if they had anything to, what they had to say on questions of gendering and theory and questions of sensitivity. Yeah, that's the question.
Okay, great, thank you. Who would like to start? Subhankar.
I could first maybe respond to you, Brian. The thing is that in that first nature of rights of nature, the conception, the environmental ethic, the way it evolved, primarily has looked at essentially philosophy, religious studies, and science. And environmentalism in general, one area that has not been paid much attention to is actually anthropology, and particularly interpretive anthropology. So long environmentalism, essentially, I mean, it's a very early exploratory phase I'm at, is kind of looking at that. The reason for it is when we are talking about these big conceptions, our tendency is to come up with a global concept, meaning abstracting things out. And when we are doing that, toward actually some kind of a just system, we are actually undermining, comes back to your question about the local, is we are undermining at times these local complexities, because local is almost always far messier than the global. So one of the things of long environmentalism is that it's not that one conception is supplanting or even overriding the other, but an ability for these things to coexist. That's why I was using the word coexist. In the case of the very specific example of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge struggle, like I said, the Gwich'in conception and the environmentalist conception have really coexisted. And the Gwich'in part was not given to them by the environmentalists. They made a claim to that space by themselves by creating their organization. The whole 15 villages came together in 1988. Since that point, because the ultimate goal is to have this space protected, preserved, the sustainability of life goes on, whether it's a caribou or myriads of life. So it's essentially having this ability for these conflicting things that may seem conflicting can coexist at times. And so that's the idea. It isn't that these will supplant other or subsume the other. It's not like that. That is what I'm kind of exploring. So I'm a little bit skeptical about global theories a lot of the times because it tend to undermine the local. So keeping the local complexity in place is actually a good thing. And you had a question to it, but maybe someone else could answer the energy question. So maybe I approach maybe a little bit of your local, address some of your local concerns or how local connects with global. National development. How, now you're talking, so there is the local issue, which is the complexity going on like in case of Ecuador, then comes the national politics of development, which may or may not conflict with that. Oftentimes, like in the Ecuador case and Bolivia, we are realizing it is conflicting. So then the local has a connection to the global, and they can reach out to international organizations. And that's taking place in many instances where the national politics is being challenged. That's happening in the US, but US, the problem is that challenging the national politics is almost impossible. For example, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge case, there has been many proposals to make that as a, let's say, UNESCO World Heritage Site. It would any day qualify for a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but even that discussion cannot come up in US politics because US will not allow that. So it is a very complicated question you're asking, that between the local connecting with the global justice, but then the national development politics comes in. It's complicated, but all three connections actually exist.
What your question in the back reminds me of is the differential politics and imperatives of environmental politics. So it means one thing to speak of, to try to assert degrowth economics in developed countries, but it means something entirely different to communities that are suffering from poverty or enforced impoverishment. So there needs to be a balance between what kind of environmental policies exist in different locations, depending on the levels of development and poverty alleviation. So I think that's what.
I'm really glad you brought it up. What like Amartya Sen called development as freedom. Yes, so development can be just, development can be sustainable. I'm glad you brought that up, right? I think I missed that point, right?
Other responses?
Well, maybe I could just add a point to this idea of development. In the case of Ecuador, the nation, presents interests in development that is not shared at all by the native communities. You'll see in the interviews talking about that the state believes that they have to come and realize large infrastructural projects, build roads, etc. They're not interested in that. They don't want any of this. But it's an idea that's imposed of the state, and it's declared as a development. So, what development means is also for debate here. And it's, but the problem is that the laws in Ecuador are one type of law for the surface, which is the indigenous rights of nature is happening on that level, whereas on the ground there is another law that is of a national kind of law that relates to all geological wells. So these two laws happen, are juxtaposed, and as Cormac said, when it's a matter of national interests, what is meant is always the economic interest. So these conflicting jurisdictions, end up being won by the state most of the time. But as an aesthetic practice, as a cultural practice that I'm involved in, I think it's very important to link local ecologies, to the engagement with local ecologies, to something larger that we have learned so much about, done so much studies about through cultural studies in the global connectedness of society. And I think in ecological, the ecology movement has until recently been much more concerned with the local and kind of scared or weary about the global because it's so connected to the global economy. But I think it's really important in aesthetic terms to bring these two together.
Responding briefly to Roz's question about the relation between gender theory and sensitivity, the figure we focused on, Charlotte King, is maybe the best known out of a number of mostly American earthquake sensitives who we analyzed and got in touch with through most of 2013 and 2014. And you can see that the particular kind of bodily symptoms that she reads as kind of indicators to predictions give Charlotte King a certain kind of authority. So an entire syndrome of particular ailments, she talks about having solar flu, particular kinds of flu, particular kinds of headaches, particular kinds of aches and pains, constitute her as a kind of authority of reading her own symptoms, which enables her to constitute an entire community around her. So she takes on quite a large importance in these particular communities, and you join them by sending her an email, and she sends you these quake reports. They're like weather reports, except they're reports on her own weather as it relates to these kind of planetary perspectives. So I would say it's not so much a question of theory; it's more a question of a passionate conviction of her own relation to geography, to seismology, to tectonics, and to the body. And in a certain sense, it's something like a contemporary version of the medieval notion of mappa mundi. The map of the world is revisited upon one's body, and one takes upon oneself the ability to decode that. I think if one lives in areas of seismic incident, massive seismic incident, whether that's Iran or whether that's Pakistan or whether that's China or Turkey or Japan or certain parts of North America, it's certainly possible to gain some kind of attunement to that. And the question is then, if you then elaborate that to something like a Weltbild, a world picture, a cosmology, but a cosmology that is made out of scientific materials, but is clearly parascientific. And I think it clearly, it's something that happens outside of science, and it happens outside of forensics. And what's interesting for us is how a figure like Charlotte King operates in a kind of autodidact manner, so that she is something like a non-scientific attempt to come to terms with the scientific vocabulary that becomes available in the moment of impending catastrophe. So we could say that when infrastructure breaks down, whether that's a so-called natural disaster or so-called man-made disaster, all kinds of misunderstandings become available. And in the earthquake sensitives, you hear an elaborated form of misunderstanding, which is something elevated to something like a worldview.
I mean, in relation to, shamans and psychics and people who read the world in their way, many shamans who go through forms of trauma, nervous breakdown, and actually have an experience of being connected to the earth and this kind of sense of a kind of solid ground that's kind of falling to pieces. And I would say in the range of psychics and shamans that I've come across, there's quite an equal gender balance going on there. And also in terms of the contributors, as Pojo said, to the USGS archive.
Okay. It's profoundly unjust to cut the conversation off right now, but I've become very sensitive to the fact that we have a right to lunch, and we have to save some time. Before you go, I'd like to say that during lunch, in this room, we'll continue with Amy Balkin's reading of the IPCC report as a continuation of her performance. And there will also be representatives of radical science and anti-fracking in the Nottingham region at this desk, organizing and asking for people to sign their petitions. So please come in the little time we have for lunch, and we'll start up at a little very soon after 2 o'clock, and I hope you definitely come back on time. We're going to start up with a presentation by Eriel Deranger, who joins us from Canada, and we'll be speaking about the politics of the tar sands. And then we'll have more panels with other artists included in the show. So thank you very much.
This was good.